My family always called me the dumb one while my sister got a full ride to Harvard. On her graduation day, Dad announced she would inherit everything: a new Cadillac and a $17 million mansion. I sat in the back quietly until a stranger walked in, handed me an envelope, and whispered that it was time to show them who I really are. I am Naomi, 33 years old, and my entire existence within the elite, unforgiving social circles of Greenwich, Connecticut was defined by a single cruel label mercilessly given to me by my own parents: the failure. As a child struggling with undiagnosed severe dyslexia, reading aloud in class was a daily torture, but reading aloud at the dinner table in our sprawling estate was a brutal trial by fire. When words danced, flipped, and scrambled on the page, my father Richard would sigh heavily, muttering dark comments about defective genetics and wasted investments, while my mother Eleanor would look away in sheer, undisguised embarrassment. They measured human worth exclusively through Ivy League degrees, country club memberships, and old money prestige. When I dropped out of college during my freshman year, entirely unable to cope with the traditional academic pressure and the lack of support, they officially stamped me as the family disgrace. What they refused to see, what they never once bothered to ask during those years of silent struggle, was that while standard textbooks failed me, I discovered a profound, innate, and highly lucrative talent for coding and complex algorithmic logic. Today, I am the founder and chief executive officer of a revolutionary supply chain risk analysis software company. I built a technology empire from absolutely nothing. But to my family, I am still just the slow, dim-witted girl who works a minimum wage data entry job. The sharp, piercing chime of a silver spoon tapping repeatedly against a crystal champagne flute sliced through the low, elegant hum of conversation. I sat silently at a small, undecorated table near the kitchen swinging doors, intentionally placed as far away as possible from the lavish flower-draped centerpieces that adorn the rest of the dining hall. My father Richard stood at the head of the room. He wore a custom-tailored suit that projected the exact image of unassailable wealth and authority he so desperately clung to. Around him sat 50 of the most elite guests in the state: hedge fund managers, corporate lawyers, and high-profile socialites, all gathered in the grand ballroom of my parents' $17 million estate to celebrate the family's true pride and joy. My younger sister, Olivia. Olivia sat to his right, radiating a smug, self-satisfied glow that filled the room. At 26 years old, she had just graduated from Harvard Law School, an achievement my parents treated as an act of divine intervention. She wore a pristine white designer dress and a heavy diamond necklace that caught the ambient light every time she tossed her head back to laugh at someone's joke. Richard raised his glass high, ensuring every eye in the room was locked firmly onto him. "Thank you all for joining us on this momentous occasion," he began, his voice booming with practiced, arrogant authority. "Today we celebrate true excellence. We celebrate the flawless continuation of our family legacy. We celebrate Olivia, a brilliant young woman who has done absolutely everything right." The guests clapped politely, raising their glasses in a synchronized display of wealth. I took a slow, measured sip of my ice water, keeping my expression entirely neutral. I knew exactly what was coming next. My father could never elevate Olivia without simultaneously using me as the dark background to make her light shine brighter. It was a sick, twisted psychological game he played to constantly assert his dominance. He gestured expansively toward the back of the room, his index finger pointing directly at my shadowy corner. "And over there, everyone, please give a round of applause to Naomi." The room physically shifted to look at me. The silence that followed was thick and incredibly uncomfortable. "Naomi is our little dropout." Richard continued, a cruel, mocking smirk playing on his lips. "She abandoned her education at 18 to become a data entry clerk or a call center operator or whatever menial task she does down in those dark little cubicles. But we invited her anyway. Thank you, Naomi, for coming to clear the tables today and for witnessing what a real successful daughter looks like. Olivia is the only child who brings actual pride to this family." A few awkward, hesitant chuckles rippled through the crowd of millionaires. Most guests simply stared at me with thinly veiled pity, whispering behind their hands. I did not flinch. I did not cry. I simply set my water glass down on the table with a soft, controlled click, letting the tense silence stretch out across the ballroom. Before the uncomfortable murmurs could completely fade, my mother Eleanor drifted over to my table. She clutched a glass of expensive Chardonnay and looked at me as if I were a physical stain on her antique Persian rug. I told you that you should not have come. She hissed, her voice low and venomous enough that only I could hear, though her rigid body language screamed utter disdain. Look at yourself. Jamal invited his Wall Street colleagues today. These are millionaires who control the financial heartbeat of the city, and you show up wearing that cheap, off-the-rack suit. You are ruining the entire aesthetic of my party. You are probably going to stain the upholstery on these antique chairs with your cheap perfume. I looked at my mother calmly. Her face was pulled tight with expensive cosmetic procedures, her eyes cold and endlessly calculating. I am wearing a custom Italian suit, Mother, I said quietly, keeping my tone perfectly flat and devoid of emotion. Not that you would ever know the difference. She rolled her eyes, completely dismissing my words as the delusional ramblings of a failure. Just stay out of sight, she commanded sharply. Do not try to network with anyone here. Do not hand out any of your pathetic little resumes. They are entirely out of your league. Suddenly, Olivia strutted over, flanked by a few of her equally haughty Harvard friends. She looked down at me, her lips curled into a triumphant, vindictive sneer. She reached into her expensive leather handbag and pulled out a heavy ring of keys attached to a faded lanyard. With a sharp flick of her wrist, she tossed them directly at my chest. They hit my collarbone hard and clattered loudly onto the wooden table. Take my old car keys, Naomi, Olivia demanded, her voice carrying loudly and clearly across the room so everyone could hear. Go wash my old sedan. Dad just bought me a brand new Cadillac Escalade and it is sitting right outside in the driveway. I do not need the old junk anymore, but maybe you can use it to drive to your little call center job. Just make sure you scrub the tires properly. I drove it through some mud yesterday. The elite guests watched the exchange, holding their collective breath, waiting for my reaction. I looked at the keys resting on the white tablecloth, then slowly looked up at my sister. The sheer arrogance radiating from her was almost palpable. She thrived on this dynamic, feeding her massive ego with my supposed public humiliation. But I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, calculated calm. I knew exactly what was happening behind the scenes of this ridiculous display of wealth, and her new Cadillac was a vital piece of the puzzle. Richard cleared his throat again, stepping aggressively back to the center of the room to reclaim the audience's attention. He signaled to a man standing near the grand staircase, who quickly hurried over carrying a thick leather-bound legal binder. Now moving on to the most important business of the evening, Richard announced, his voice echoing powerfully off the vaulted ceilings. Olivia has proven her worth. She has secured the family honor with her degree. Therefore, Eleanor and I have decided to officially establish the new family trust today. The crowd murmured in polite appreciation. Richard puffed out his chest, looking like a king addressing his subjects. This $17 million estate, along with all the controlling shares of our family business holdings, will be placed entirely under the management of Olivia and her brilliant husband Jamal. They are the undeniable future of this family. He then turned his gaze back to me, his eyes narrowing into dark, threatening slits. But to ensure that this financial transition is completely secure, we must handle some unpleasant housekeeping. He gestured aggressively to the man with the binder, who scurried over to my table and slapped a heavy stack of legal documents right in front of me. Richard walked over, standing intimidatingly close so he could look straight down his nose at me. Naomi, you are going to sign this renunciation of inheritance, he dictated, his voice hard, sharp, and uncompromising. You will officially surrender any and all claims to this estate, to the family business, and to our financial assets. I am doing this to protect Olivia. I know exactly how people like you operate. You fail at life, you end up poor and destitute, and then you come crawling back to beg your successful sister for handouts. I will not allow you to leech off her hard work and her husband's brilliance. Sign it now in front of all these witnesses so you never come crying for money later. The humiliation was meticulously designed to be absolute. He wanted to break me publicly to cement my status as the outcast, the failure who deserved absolutely nothing from her own blood. My mother stood beside him, her arms crossed tight, nodding in vigorous self-righteous agreement. "Sign it, Naomi," Eleanor urged sharply, tapping her manicured finger on the table. "Do not make this any more embarrassing for yourself than it already is. You have never contributed a single thing of value to this family, so do not pretend you deserve a piece of it now." I looked down at the thick stack of legal papers. The bold black letters at the top clearly stated it was a total and complete surrender of familial rights and assets. A heavy gold-plated fountain pen lay beside the document, placed there specifically for this theatrical, degrading moment. I reached out slowly and picked up the pen. The metal felt cool and remarkably solid in my hand. I rolled it between my fingers, feeling its weight, its balance, its sharp tip. The entire room watched in absolute breathless silence, fully expecting me to bow my head, shed a tear of crushing defeat, and sign my life away just as I had always been expected to do. I looked at my father, whose face was set in a victorious sneer. I looked at my mother, who was already turning away in dismissal. I looked at Olivia, who was practically vibrating with malicious joy. Instead of removing the cap to write my name, I gripped the pen tightly in my fist. I raised my hand slightly and brought the pen down with a sudden violent downward force. The sharp metal tip stabbed directly through the thick stack of legal documents, piercing the paper with a loud crunch and embedding itself deeply into the polished wood of the table beneath. The loud thud echoed like a gunshot through the silent ballroom. Several guests gasped loudly, taking a sudden shocked step back. My father jumped, his eyes widening in pure shock and escalating outrage. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he shouted, his face turning a deep, angry, blotchy red. "You are destroying an antique table. You are insane." I did not break eye contact with him. I left the pen standing upright, pinned through the papers like a dagger claiming its territory. "I am not signing anything," I said, my voice perfectly level, carrying an icy, unwavering authority that made my father instinctively take a step back. "And frankly, Richard, I think you are being a bit premature with your grand, boastful announcements today. Are you absolutely certain this $17 million mansion is still yours to give away?" The question hung in the air, heavy and loaded with a dark implication that no one in the room could quite process. My father's face contorted in deep confusion, followed swiftly by a fresh, unhinged wave of rage. Before he could formulate a screaming response, the crowd physically parted as a tall, impeccably dressed man strode purposefully toward my table. It was Jamal, my brother-in-law. Jamal was 29 years old, an African-American man who built his entire personality and social standing around the manufactured image of a highly successful Wall Street wealth manager. He wore a custom-tailored Tom Ford suit that cost more than a standard vehicle, a heavy gold Rolex watch glinting on his wrist, and leather loafers that clicked sharply against the marble floor. He had leveraged his charismatic charm to marry into my family, and my parents absolutely adored him because he spoke their exact language of money status and ruthless financial ambition. He stepped quickly in front of my father, holding up a hand as if to calm a subordinate employee. "I will handle this, Richard," Jamal said, his voice dripping with smooth condescension. He turned to me, a patronizing, pitying smile spreading across his face. He grabbed the gold pen, yanking it forcefully out of the table and tossing it aside, then snatched up the pierced documents. "Listen to me, big sister," Jamal began, leaning in close so I could smell the overpowering, expensive cologne radiating off his skin. "You really do not understand how the real world works, do you? A person with no brain, someone who cannot even read a basic textbook properly without stuttering like a child, has no business talking about wealth management trusts or property rights." He straightened his expensive cuffs, looking around the room to ensure the millionaire guests were watching his masterful handling of the situation. "Richard and Eleanor have entrusted me with complete financial control over their portfolio. Why? Because I am a professional. I manage millions of dollars every single day. I was born to generate wealth, to multiply it, to conquer the markets. You, on the other hand, were born to fail. It is just basic genetics and market reality. Do not fight it. I watched him perform, noting the slight, uncontrollable tremor in his left hand, the microscopic beads of nervous sweat forming along his perfectly lined hairline. He was putting on a brilliant, arrogant show, but I knew exactly what lay beneath the expensive suit. Do not make a scene here, Naomi. Jamal continued, reaching into the inner pocket of his jacket. You are embarrassing yourself, and you are embarrassing my wife on her special day. We all know you are struggling. We all know your little data entry job barely pays your rent. He pulled out a sleek designer leather wallet and quickly extracted 5 crisp $100 bills. He threw the money onto the table with a flick of his wrist, letting the bills flutter down aggressively next to my water glass. Here, Jamal said, his voice loud enough for the back row of guests to hear perfectly. Take this. Consider it a tip for showing up and behaving yourself. Take the $500, go buy yourself a decent meal, and take an Uber back to whatever miserable tiny apartment you crawled out of. Let the adults handle the real business from here on out. My parents beamed with absolute pride at his display. Olivia clapped her hands together, laughing out loud at her husband's brutal display of financial dominance over her older sister. Look at him, Olivia cheered, raising her glass. He is so generous to you, Naomi. You should say thank you and leave before you ruin anything else. I looked down at the $500 resting on the white linen. I did not touch it. I slowly shifted my gaze back to Jamal, observing the desperate, hollow arrogance in his eyes. Just as Jamal opened his mouth to deliver another cutting insult, the massive, heavy oak doors at the main entrance of the grand ballroom flew open with a thunderous crash. The explosive sound startled everyone. The string quartet stopped playing abruptly, bows frozen in the air. The guests turned around, murmuring in confusion and alarm as the cold night air swept into the warm, perfumed room. A man stepped confidently through the doorway. He was completely out of place in this sea of colorful evening gowns and flashy designer tuxedos. He wore a sharp, severe charcoal gray suit, carrying a sleek black leather briefcase. He had an imposing, authoritative presence that commanded immediate, absolute attention. 2 of my father's hired security guards rushed forward to intercept him, shouting for him to stop, but the man didn't even break his stride. He simply flashed a silver badge from inside his jacket, and the guards instantly backed away, their faces turning pale. My father marched forward, his face purple with indignation. "Who the hell are you?" Richard demanded, pointing a trembling finger at the intruder. "This is a private graduation party. How did you get past my gate security?" The man ignored my father completely. He walked right past Richard, right past a shocked Eleanor, right past Olivia and Jamal. His heavy, measured footsteps echoed on the marble as he walked a straight line directly to the small, dark table in the corner where I was sitting. He stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me. He stood tall, completely ignoring the 50 elite guests who were watching with bated breath. He opened his leather briefcase, retrieved a thick envelope sealed with bright red wax, and held it out to me with both hands in a gesture of absolute, undeniable respect. Mr. Gallagher bowed his head slightly. "Boss, the funds have officially cleared the international accounts," he said, his voice carrying clearly and powerfully through the silent room. "The transaction is finalized. It is time to show them who you really are." I reached out and took the red sealed envelope. The paper felt heavy, loaded with the weight of 15 years of humiliation, 15 years of being called the dumb one, 15 years of silent, agonizing hard work. I broke the red wax seal with my thumb, the cracking sound echoing loudly in the breathless ballroom. I looked up at Jamal, who was staring at Mr. Gallagher with a sudden, unexplainable terror in his eyes. I looked at my father, whose mouth was hanging slightly open in pure shock. I pulled a single sheet of paper from the envelope. It was not a renunciation. It was not a plea for help. It was a certified financial document that was about to turn this entire $17 million estate into dust. I stood up from my chair, smoothing the wrinkles from my custom suit, and smiled at my family. The heavy silence in the grand ballroom shattered the moment my father found his voice. Richard's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson as he marched aggressively toward my table. He pointed a trembling finger directly at Mr. Gallagher, completely ignoring the heavy red wax seal on the envelope I now held. "Who the hell is this cheap scam artist you brought into my home?" Richard demanded, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. I told security strictly no uninvited guests. You hire some low-level actor to crash your sister's graduation dinner just because you cannot handle her success. Get this man out of here before I call the police. Mr. Gallagher did not even blink. He calmly adjusted the cuffs of his tailored charcoal suit and met my father's furious gaze with absolute chilling indifference. "I assure you, Richard, I am no actor," Mr. Gallagher said, his tone razor-sharp and entirely unbothered. "I am a senior partner and legal counsel for Apex Holdings, and I certainly do not work for you." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of 50 elite guests. In the wealthy circles of Greenwich, Connecticut, everyone knew the name Apex Holdings. They were the apex predators of private equity, known for ruthlessly liquidating failing empires. My mother Eleanor rushed forward, her expensive heels clicking frantically against the marble floor. She grabbed Richard's arm, her eyes darting nervously toward the whispering hedge fund managers and socialites surrounding us. "This is absurd!" Eleanor hissed, her perfectly manicured hands trembling slightly. "Naomi is a data entry clerk. She barely makes minimum wage. She probably found his business card on the street and is playing some pathetic, desperate game to ruin Olivia's special night. Do not let her embarrass us in front of Jamal's Wall Street colleagues." I looked at my mother, feeling a profound sense of liberation. The scared, dyslexic teenager they had thrown out of the house was completely dead. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply reached into the envelope Mr. Gallagher had handed me and pulled out a crisp, heavy sheet of paper. "You are right about one thing, Mother," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the room. "This is a very special night for Olivia, especially considering her grand graduation gift." I stepped away from my small table and walked deliberately toward my sister. Olivia stood next to Jamal, her smug expression faltering for the very first time. She instinctively took a half-step backward as I approached her, grip tightening on the stem of her champagne flute. I did not stop until I was standing directly in front of her. I raised the document and slapped it flat against the center of her chest. The paper fluttered down and landed right next to the heavy ring of old car keys she had thrown at me earlier. "You bragged about that brand-new Cadillac Escalade sitting in the driveway," I said, locking eyes with her. "You tossed me your old keys and told me to go wash it. A stunning graduation present from Daddy to his golden child." "It is a custom order," Olivia snapped back, her voice shrill and defensive. "A symbol of my hard work at Harvard, something a college dropout like you will never comprehend." "I comprehend finance perfectly well, Olivia," I replied, leaning in slightly. "Which is why I know that Daddy's platinum credit card was declined exactly 2 hours and 14 minutes ago at the luxury dealership." The entire ballroom went dead silent. The clinking of glasses ceased. Even the breathing of the guests seemed to pause. My father lunged forward, his veins bulging against his stiff collar. "That is an outrageous lie. My accounts have absolutely no limits. I have been banking with them for 30 years. You are fabricating garbage to steal the spotlight." I ignored him entirely, keeping my focus locked on my sister's rapidly paling face. "The general manager of the dealership ran the card 3 times, Olivia. Insufficient funds, every single time. In fact, you were sitting in the driver's seat, gripping the leather steering wheel, when the manager called the local police to report an attempted grand theft auto. You tried to drive a $120,000 vehicle off the lot without paying." "Stop making things up!" Olivia screamed, her voice cracking in panic. She looked wildly at Jamal for support, but Jamal was suddenly very still, his eyes darting frantically toward the floor. "Read the paper I just threw at you," I commanded. "It is the final cleared invoice from the dealership. The police were 5 minutes away from putting you in handcuffs in your pristine white dress. They were going to impound the Cadillac and arrest you for fraud on the afternoon of your Harvard graduation." Eleanor rushed over and snatched the paper from the table. Her eyes scanned the bold print, and all the color instantly drained from her face. She let out a sharp, choked gasp, dropping the document as if it had physically burned her. Who paid this? Eleanor whispered, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. The invoice says paid in full via wire transfer. I did, I stated, the absolute authority in my voice ringing off the walls. I am the one who wired the dealership the $120,000. I paid for the Cadillac Escalade. I bought your graduation gift, Olivia, so you would not spend tonight sitting in a concrete holding cell. Olivia's mouth opened and closed completely, unable to form a coherent word. The guests began whispering furiously, the scandal too delicious for them to ignore. The perfect facade of the Greenwich elite family was cracking wide open, and the ugly reality was spilling out onto the polished marble floors. "This is impossible!" Richard stammered frantically, pulling his phone from his pocket and aggressively tapping the screen to open his banking application. "There is a mistake, a bank error. Jamal is managing our liquid assets." Jamal told me the funds were perfectly positioned. I turned my gaze slowly toward my brother-in-law. Jamal stood rigid, his custom Tom Ford suit suddenly looking like a very expensive straitjacket. The confident, arrogant Wall Street wealth manager who had just thrown $500 at me was visibly sweating. "Yes, let us talk about Jamal," I said, taking a step toward him. "Let us talk about the financial genius who has been steering this family's wealth. Because I find it absolutely fascinating that a top-tier investment manager would let his father-in-law's credit card bounce on a simple car purchase." Jamal puffed out his chest, desperately trying to regain control of the room. "You do not know what you are talking about, Naomi. The markets are volatile." I shifted Richard's capital into high-yield offshore accounts to maximize the quarterly returns. It was a temporary liquidity lockup, standard Wall Street procedure. "You would not understand the complexity of our portfolio." "Oh, I understand complexity." I smiled, a cold, sharp expression that made Jamal swallow hard. "My company specializes in deep data risk analysis. We build algorithms that track missing money across global supply chains and hidden corporate ledgers. So when the dealership manager called me panicking because he knew my name from a recent tech journal profile, I decided to run a quick, comprehensive audit on your so-called portfolio." I pulled my phone from my pocket and held it up. "You claim you are maximizing their returns, Jamal. So why exactly did my system find $12 million in margin debt tied directly to your personal accounts?" The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute, broken only by the sharp, ragged intake of breath from my mother. My father, Richard, stood completely paralyzed for a fraction of a second before his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated denial. He let out a harsh, barking laugh that echoed awkwardly against the crystal chandeliers above us. "You are out of your mind, Naomi." Richard sneered, his voice dripping with venom and forced bravado. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. "You come into my home uninvited and spew this absolute garbage just to ruin your sister's graduation." Jamal is a senior wealth manager. He handles multi-million-dollar portfolios for the most elite clients in Manhattan. You are a failed data clerk. Do you honestly expect anyone in this room to believe your fabricated numbers over a proven financial expert? I did not flinch. I kept my phone raised, the screen glowing brightly in the dim light of the ballroom. "I do not expect you to believe me, Richard," I replied, my voice steady and cold. "I expect you to believe your own bank. Open your phone right now. Log into your primary executive account, the one you so proudly handed over to Jamal with a full power of attorney so he could supposedly double your net worth." Richard scoffed loudly, dramatically, reaching into his tailored suit pocket to retrieve his smartphone. With pleasure, he spat. "I will pull up my account right now, and when everyone here sees the 8-figure balance Jamal secured for me this quarter, I will have my security guards physically throw you out of my house." He tapped the screen of his phone aggressively, holding the device up slightly so the guests standing nearby could witness his impending victory. The room held its collective breath. 50 millionaires, corporate lawyers, and high society elites leaned in, their eyes darting nervously between my father's confident face and the glowing screen in his hand. I watched closely as his banking application loaded. I watched the exact moment my father's arrogant sneer faltered. It happened in excruciating slow motion. The aggressive, proud posture of his shoulders collapsed instantly. The healthy, flushed color of his face drained away in a matter of seconds, leaving behind a sickly ashen gray. His eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror as they locked onto the digital display. His hand began to shake so violently that he nearly dropped the expensive device onto the hard marble floor. On his screen, highlighted in a glaring, unforgiving red font, was a negative balance. His primary checking account, his vast savings, the liquid capital he used to maintain this $17 million lifestyle, were completely gone, wiped clean, overdrawn by hundreds of thousands of dollars. "This cannot be right," Richard whispered, his voice cracking into a high, panicked wheeze. He tapped the screen frantically, refreshing the application over and over again, as if sheer willpower could magically restore his missing fortune. "This is a glitch. The bank system is down. Jamal, tell them the bank network is down." Jamal did not answer him. The smooth, charismatic Wall Street persona had completely evaporated. Sweat poured down his forehead, soaking into the pristine white collar of his expensive suit. His eyes darted wildly toward the grand exit doors. He knew the game was officially over. He reached out, grabbing Olivia's wrist with a grip so tight she let out a sharp cry of pain. "We need to leave," Jamal muttered, his voice tight and frantic. "We are leaving right now, Olivia. There has been a massive security breach. Her sister hired hackers to lock the accounts. We have to go to the police station immediately to report this crime." He pulled Olivia aggressively toward the doorway, trying to shove his way past the bewildered, whispering guests. But I anticipated his cowardice. I stepped smoothly into the aisle, planting my heels firmly onto the marble floor, physically blocking their only exit. Mr. Gallagher stepped up right beside me, his imposing presence forming an impenetrable wall. "You are not going anywhere, Jamal," I said, crossing my arms over my chest and staring him down. "Move out of my way, Naomi," Jamal growled, dropping the polite, condescending tone he had used all evening. He tried to shoulder past me, but Mr. Gallagher raised one hand, a silent, heavily implied warning that made Jamal freeze immediately in his tracks. I tilted my head, looking directly into my brother-in-law's panicked eyes. I turned my attention back to my father, who was still staring at his phone, breathing heavily as if he were actively suffocating. "Did you honestly believe his lies, Richard?" I asked, projecting my voice so every single guest could hear the undeniable truth. "Did you really believe Jamal was legally investing your money for a guaranteed 20% return every single month? Anyone with a basic understanding of market economics knows that a guaranteed 20% monthly return does not exist in legitimate finance. It is the textbook definition of a Ponzi scheme. But you were too blinded by his expensive suits and his smooth talk to do a basic background check on the man marrying your golden child." My mother Eleanor rushed forward, grabbing Richard's arm with trembling hands. "Richard, what does the screen say?" she demanded, her voice shrill with rising hysteria. "What did he do to our money?" I did not let Richard answer her. I stepped closer to Jamal, forcing him to shrink back defensively. "Did you not find it strange, Richard?" I continued relentlessly. "Did it never cross your mind to question why a supposedly brilliant, high-earning Wall Street executive would let his wife pick up her brand-new luxury vehicle using her father's credit card? If Jamal is so incredibly wealthy, why is he siphoning your funds to pay for Olivia's lifestyle?" Olivia yanked her arm out of Jamal's grip, her face contorted in deep confusion and growing horror. "Jamal, what is she talking about?" Olivia demanded, her voice trembling uncontrollably. "You told me you bought the car. You told me you wired the money from your offshore account yesterday morning. Why is my sister saying my car was paid for with Dad's card?" Jamal opened his mouth, but only a pathetic, breathless stammer came out. He looked at the surrounding crowd, his wealthy peers, the people he had tried to impress all night. Their faces were masks of pure disgust and harsh judgment. "Let me show you exactly where your offshore money went." "Olivia," I said. I pulled a small remote from my pocket. Earlier today, while the catering staff was setting up the dining hall, I had quietly synced my device to the massive 80-inch flat-screen television mounted above the fireplace in the adjacent living room. I pressed the main button. The large screen clicked to life, instantly drawing the eyes of every single person in the grand ballroom. The screen mirrored my phone display perfectly. I opened the encrypted file my software had compiled and swiped my finger upward. A massive spreadsheet flooded the television screen. It was not a prestigious portfolio of successful blue-chip stocks or high-yield bonds. It was a terrifying, chaotic ledger of aggressive margin calls, highly leveraged cryptocurrency derivatives, and exorbitant loans taken from predatory shadow credit funds. Every single transaction was flagged with a massive red warning indicator. Every single loan document was electronically signed and fully authorized. "Look at the top of the contract, Olivia," I commanded, pointing at the glowing screen. Olivia stepped forward, her eyes scanning the massive television display. She read the name listed as the primary debtor. It was not Richard's name. It was Jamal's full legal name. He had forged my father's power of attorney to use the family estate as collateral to secure his own personal reckless gambling debts on the shadow market. I scrolled to the very bottom of the ledger, highlighting the final aggregated total in bold, undeniable numbers. The guests gasped loudly as the final figure flashed on the screen for the entire room to witness: $12 million. The glaring red number on the massive 80-inch screen burned into the retinas of every single person in the grand ballroom. $12 million. The sheer weight of that figure hung over the catered tables and floral centerpieces like a physical guillotine. For a fraction of a second, the room was entirely devoid of sound. No clinking crystal, no hushed whispers, not even the rustle of expensive silk. Then the immaculate illusion of the golden child shattered completely. Olivia let out a sound that was half shriek and half breathless gasp. Her pristine white Harvard graduation dress suddenly looked absurd against the violent mottled red creeping up her neck and spreading across her face. She spun around to face her husband. The smug, self-satisfied glow she had worn all evening vanished, replaced by an ugly primal panic. She raised her hand and struck Jamal across the face with a vicious, echoing slap that snapped his head to the side. "You liar!" Olivia screamed, her voice tearing through the elegant acoustic space of the mansion. "What is that number, Jamal? What did you do?" Jamal stumbled backward, his hand flying to his rapidly swelling cheek. He opened his mouth, his confident Wall Street vocabulary entirely failing him. He looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting from the furious face of his wife to the damning evidence projected above the fireplace. He tried to reach out to her, his hands trembling violently. Olivia smacked his hands away and whipped around to face me. Her eyes were wide, manic, and completely unhinged. She could not process that her perfect life was a lie, so her mind instinctively reverted to its favorite defense mechanism: blaming me. "You did this!" Olivia shrieked, marching toward me with her fists clenched so tightly her knuckles turned bone white. "You fabricated this entire thing. You are a filthy, jealous hacker. You could not handle the fact that I graduated from Harvard while you are nothing but a dropout failure. You used your pathetic little computer skills to break into Jamal's private network and manipulate the data. You are committing a federal cybercrime right now. I will have you arrested and thrown in federal prison for this." Her accusations were wild, desperate, and entirely devoid of logic. She pointed a shaking finger at the screen, then back at me, panting heavily, as if she had just sprinted a mile. "You are trying to frame my husband because you are obsessed with ruining my life." Before I could even offer a response, my mother thrust herself directly into the center of the chaos. Eleanor could feel the judgmental eyes of the Greenwich elite burning into her back. The society matron realized that her entire social standing, her prestigious country club memberships, and her carefully curated image of generational wealth were actively disintegrating. She refused to let it happen. She chose absolute aggressive denial. "Stop this nonsense immediately!" Eleanor commanded, her voice shrill and trembling with an artificial authority. She turned her back to the giant television screen, as if refusing to look at the $12 million debt would magically erase it from existence. She plastered on a terrifyingly wide, frantic smile and addressed the crowd of silent, staring millionaires. "Please, everyone, do not pay attention to this ridiculous display," Eleanor announced, letting out a high, breathless laugh that sounded dangerously close to a sob. "It is clearly just a routing error, a glitch in the banking system. You all know how unreliable technology can be these days. My son-in-law is a brilliant man. Jamal is a senior executive at a top-tier firm. He brings in millions of dollars in performance bonuses every single year. He manages billions for the most exclusive clients in the country. This is nothing but a temporary server malfunction blown out of proportion by a jealous, disturbed girl who wants attention. Eleanor looked around the room, her eyes begging the wealthy guests to agree with her to validate her desperate reality. But the hedge fund managers and corporate lawyers in the crowd were not looking at Eleanor. They were staring intently at the spreadsheet on the screen. These were men and women who read financial ledgers for a living. They recognized the standard formatting of shadow market lending. They saw the verifiable digital signatures, the cryptographic transaction hashes, and the indisputable margin call alerts. They knew a glitch did not produce a perfectly formatted, legally binding trail of catastrophic debt. Jamal desperately lunged at the lifeline my mother threw him. He straightened his tie with shaking fingers and forced a laugh that sounded like dry leaves crushing together. Exactly, Jamal stammered, wiping a thick layer of sweat from his upper lip. Eleanor is absolutely right. It is a technical anomaly. I was moving a large block of capital through a decentralized blockchain protocol to bypass standard capital gains taxes for Richard. The interface just misinterpreted the leverage ratio. I will make one phone call to my developers in the morning and have this visual error cleared up before breakfast. He looked at the crowd, attempting to project his usual smooth charisma, but his voice cracked on the final word. He took a step toward his father-in-law, extending a hand in a plea for solidarity. Richard physically recoiled, stepping back so quickly he nearly knocked over a tray of champagne flutes. Jamal was drowning, and he knew it. The elite guests literally began inching away from him, treating him like a contagious disease. I stood my ground, watching the pathetic, crumbling facade of the family that had mocked my intelligence for 33 years. I did not raise my voice to shout over Olivia's manic accusations or Eleanor's desperate lies. I let their panic ring through the room until the sheer weight of the silence returned. I raised my hand and pointed a single steady finger directly at Jamal. "He is not a director," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy, perfumed air with the cold, precise efficiency of a surgical scalpel. "He does not manage billions. He does not have a team of developers." Jamal physically shrank back, as if my words carried a physical force. Eleanor opened her mouth to scream another denial, but the absolute authority in my tone stopped her dead in her tracks. Jamal was fired exactly 8 months ago. I continued, holding his terrified gaze. He was marched out of his firm by security for systematically defrauding his own clients. But he could not bear to tell his Harvard wife or his wealthy in-laws that he was a disgraced failure. So he kept putting on his expensive suits every morning. He kept driving his luxury cars, and to maintain that lie, he needed cash, massive amounts of it. I gestured toward the television screen behind me. For the past 8 months, he has been secretly using the comprehensive power of attorney you blindly gave him, Richard. He took your pristine credit, your liquid assets, and the equity of this very estate, and he dumped it all into highly leveraged, unregulated crypto derivatives. He was gambling with your entire legacy, utilizing 100 times leverage on garbage altcoins, hoping for a miraculous payout to cover his criminal tracks. But the market shifted, and yesterday afternoon, every single one of his positions got completely and violently liquidated. He burned it all to the ground. Richard let out a sound that was no longer human. It was a guttural, terrifying roar of a man watching his entire empire evaporate into thin air. He lunged forward with blinding speed, completely ignoring the stunned, wealthy guests surrounding them. His hands shot out and locked onto the lapels of Jamal's custom charcoal suit. The sheer force of Richard's momentum drove Jamal backward until he slammed violently into a linen-draped cocktail table. Crystal glasses shattered against the marble floor. Champagne sprayed across Jamal's terrified face as he crashed down, taking the table with him. "You stole from me!" Richard bellowed, his face inches from Jamal, spit flying from his lips. "You bankrupt my family. I will kill you." Jamal scrambled desperately, his hands clawing at Richard's wrists, trying to break the older man's iron grip. He kicked out his polished leather shoes, slipping uselessly on the champagne-soaked marble. Olivia let out a blood-curdling scream. She threw herself into the melee, grabbing her father's shoulders and sobbing hysterically. "Stop it!" Olivia shrieked, her perfect white graduation dress now stained with spilled wine and dirt. "You are killing him! Let him go, Dad! Let him go!" The ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. Elite hedge fund managers and corporate lawyers scrambled backward to avoid the flying glass and flailing limbs. Two security guards rushed through the double oak doors, but they froze, completely unsure of how to handle the patriarch of the estate physically assaulting his own son-in-law. Eleanor did not look at her husband. She did not look at the ruined $12 million ledger still glowing an angry red on the television screen. She turned her entire trembling frame toward me. Her eyes were bloodshot and completely wild. "You did this," Eleanor hissed, her voice vibrating with a toxic, desperate hatred. "You ruined this family. You came here today to destroy us because you are nothing. You have always been a bitter, jealous failure." She stepped closer, her manicured finger jabbing the air inches from my face. "So what if the money is tied up? We will rebuild. We always do. Because we have class. We have pedigree. Olivia has a degree from Harvard University. She is brilliant and destined for absolute greatness. No matter what happens tonight, she will always be better than a stupid, uneducated dropout like you." I looked at my mother. I looked at the frantic, delusional woman desperately clinging to a piece of paper as her entire world burned to the ground. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. I threw my head back and laughed. It was a loud, genuine laugh that cut straight through the sounds of the physical struggle behind me. My laughter was so jarring, so completely out of place in this nightmare, that Richard actually froze. He released Jamal, who slumped against the ruined table, violently gasping for air and clutching his bruised throat. Olivia stopped screaming, her hands covering her mouth. The entire room went dead silent, once again watching me. "Olivia has a full academic scholarship to Harvard," I said, projecting my voice so it carried to the very back of the vaulted room. "That is the legendary story you fed the Greenwich Country Club for 4 years. The brilliant golden child whose intellect was so profound that the Ivy League practically begged her to attend for free." Eleanor stiffened, her jaw locking tight. "She is brilliant," Eleanor snapped, though her voice wavered. "There was no scholarship, Eleanor," I stated, my tone dropping to a deadly, undeniable whisper. "Not a single dime of merit-based aid. Olivia was flatly rejected during the early admissions round. Her test scores were entirely average. Her essays were mediocre. But you could not handle the social embarrassment of your golden child failing." So Richard made a phone call. I turned my gaze to my father, who was slowly standing up, his chest heaving. "You contacted a private admissions consultant who specializes in placing wealthy, underperforming students through the back door," I continued relentlessly. "And that consultant demanded an exorbitant cash donation to the university's development fund to secure her spot. $2.5 million to be exact." Olivia gasped loudly, stepping away from Jamal and staring at her parents in pure horror. "You told me I earned it," Olivia whimpered, her voice cracking. "You told me my application was flawless." I ignored her completely and kept my eyes locked on Eleanor. "But Richard's business was already highly leveraged back then. You did not have $2.5 million in liquid cash to spare. So you found another source. You accessed the sealed family trust. You secretly drained the entire inheritance fund Grandpa Theodore explicitly left for me." The silence in the room was so heavy it felt suffocating. I watched the remaining color drain from Eleanor's face. "You needed dual signatures to bypass the trust lock," I said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward my parents. "Grandpa Theodore knew exactly how greedy you both were. He set up that account specifically for my future because he saw how you treated me. He knew you favored Olivia. He wanted me to have an unbreakable safety net when I finally walked away from this toxic household. The money was strictly locked until my 25th birthday." I pulled a folded legal document from my inside jacket pocket and held it up. "But Richard used his corrupt connections at the bank to forge a developmental hardship claim. You submitted falsified medical documents stating I required long-term residential psychiatric care. You legally declared me mentally unfit so you could liquidate my assets. You stole my inheritance to buy a vanity degree for a daughter who could not pass the entrance exam on her own merit. You call me a stupid dropout, I said, my voice echoing with years of suppressed rage. I dropped out because my tuition checks suddenly bounced. I dropped out because the bank told me my college fund was empty. I spent 5 years eating instant noodles and working 3 jobs to build my data firm from scratch, believing my grandfather had made a tragic financial error before he died. I stepped right up to Eleanor, looking down into her terrified, trembling eyes. But there was no error. You stole my future to purchase a fake title for your precious golden child. You called me a failure while using my money to buy her a crown. And the ultimate beautiful irony is that you handed that multi-million-dollar Harvard graduate over to a fraudulent con artist who just lost every single penny you had left to your name. The blinding flash of countless smartphone cameras illuminated the grand ballroom as the Greenwich elite eagerly documented the spectacular collapse of my parents' carefully curated empire. Whispers escalated into a chaotic symphony of scandalized murmurs. Corporate titans and socialite matrons who had sipped my father vintage champagne just moments ago were now openly recording his complete destruction. Eleanor collapsed against a floral centerpiece, her manicured hands covering her face as she sobbed into the white silk tablecloth. Olivia stood frozen, her eyes darting between me and the glowing spreadsheet on the television screen, her mind entirely incapable of processing the reality that her prestigious Ivy League identity was entirely financed by criminal theft and deception. Richard absolutely refused to surrender to the public humiliation. He was a man who had built his entire existence on intimidation and the illusion of absolute control. Even as the undeniable proof of his financial ruin and moral bankruptcy flashed in high definition behind him, his pride demanded a final, desperate stand. He aggressively smoothed the fine lapels of his wrinkled custom Italian tuxedo jacket. He pulled his shoulders back, puffing out his chest to project an authority that no longer existed. He cleared his throat, adjusting his silk tie with trembling fingers, attempting to summon the commanding presence that had terrorized me throughout my childhood. "You think you have won, Naomi?" Richard barked, his voice grating against the stunned, absolute silence of the enormous room. "You think a few fabricated digital records and a stolen inheritance fund will erase who I am? You are nothing but an ungrateful parasite trying to drag your betters down into the mud. I am Richard Vance. I built a corporate legacy from the ground up while you were busy playing with spreadsheets. I do not care what numbers you project on that screen. I do not care what temporary liquidity crisis Jamal has stumbled into. You are vastly underestimating the depth of my vast financial resources." He stepped forward, waving his arm broadly to encompass the sweeping architecture of the grand ballroom, the vaulted ceilings and the crystal chandeliers. "I am still the sole owner of this $17 million estate. This property alone is worth more than you will ever earn in 10 pathetic lifetimes. If Jamal has mismanaged my liquid capital, I will simply rectify it myself without delay. I will call my brokers tomorrow morning at 9 sharp. I will liquidate exactly half of my shares in the powerful family corporation. That sale alone will instantly generate more than enough cash to completely erase this pathetic $12 million margin debt." Richard glared at me with pure, unfiltered, toxic contempt. He pointed his finger straight at the heavy oak exit doors located at the very back of the grand hall. "We do not need your money, and we certainly do not need your highly offensive presence. My family will easily absorb this incredibly minor temporary inconvenience. We will clean up Jamal and his financial garbage completely by ourselves without breaking a single sweat. You came here to humiliate us, but you only proved your own bitter, pathetic irrelevance. Now get out of my house before I have the heavily armed authorities drag you violently off my pristine property in tight steel handcuffs for illegal corporate espionage." I did not move a single solitary muscle. I did not even bother responding to his truly delusional, pathetic rant. Instead, I simply shifted my gaze past his rigid shoulder. The sound that interrupted my father's arrogant speech did not come from me. It came from the floor. It started as a low, wet cough, followed by a wheezing chuckle that grated against the tense, heavy atmosphere of the silent ballroom. Jamal was still slumped against the shattered, ruined remains of the expensive cocktail table. His custom suit was soaked in champagne and stained with dirt from the marble floor. A thin stream of dark crimson blood leaked from the corner of his split lip, a souvenir from Richard's sudden, violent assault just moments earlier. Jamal tilted his head back against the twisted metal of the table leg and began to laugh. It was a manic, hysterical, entirely unhinged sound of a broken man. The laughter echoed through the massive room, chilling and completely devoid of humor. Richard whipped around his face, turning an angry, dangerous shade of deep purple. "Shut your mouth, Jamal!" Richard roared, his fists clenching at his sides. "I am saving your pathetic life tomorrow morning. You will sit there and keep your mouth shut until I handle this mess." Jamal wiped the blood from his chin with the back of his trembling hand, smearing the crimson stain across his pale cheek. His crazed, bloodshot eyes locked directly onto my father. "Oh, father-in-law," Jamal wheezed, his chest heaving as another hysterical laugh forced its way out of his bruised throat. "You really do not understand how any of this works, do you? You are not going to call your brokers in the morning. You are not going to sell half of your corporate shares to save me." Richard took a menacing step toward him. "What did you just say to me, you worthless parasite? Did you honestly forget the paperwork you signed?" Jamal sneered, a terrifying crooked smile stretching across his battered face. "Did you forget that you gave me complete, unrestricted power of attorney over your entire portfolio so I could aggressively manage your assets? I did not just lose the liquid cash, Richard. When the market crashed last month, the brokers issued a massive margin call. I needed emergency capital to keep the positions open. I needed millions in hard assets to stop the liquidation protocol. So I used the power of attorney. This $17 million estate. Your precious corporate shares. I mortgaged the deed to this house and transferred every single family share to the shadow bank to cover my losses 30 days ago. You do not own absolutely anything anymore." The sheer magnitude of Jamal's confession dropped like a live grenade in the center of the grand ballroom. For one agonizing second, the silence held stretched to its absolute limit by the sheer impossibility of what had just been said. Then the entire room exploded. The carefully maintained decorum of the Greenwich elite shattered instantly. Panic swept through the crowd like an uncontrolled wildfire. These were people whose entire existence depended on proximity to power and wealth, and the stench of poverty and federal fraud had just infected the very air they were breathing. Hedge fund managers shoved past socialites. Corporate attorneys frantically barked orders into their cell phones as they scrambled toward the Grand Oak exit doors. No one wanted to be in the background of the inevitable police photographs. No one wanted their faces attached to the Vance family's spectacular demise. Women in designer gowns grabbed their expensive clutches from the catered tables, knocking over crystal champagne flutes in their absolute haste to flee the sinking ship. The exodus was violent, selfish, and incredibly fast. Within seconds, the illusion of my parents' untouchable social empire was trampled under the frantic, rushing heels of their so-called friends. Eleanor watched her precious high society abandon her. Her eyes darted wildly, tracking the retreating backs of the country club presidents and gala organizers she had spent decades brown-nosing. The reality of her sudden absolute social annihilation hit her with the force of a freight train. She had no money, no leverage, and no audience left to manipulate. Desperate to reclaim control, desperate for a single drop of sympathy, to anchor herself to my mother, resorted to her oldest, most pathetic trick. She let out a piercing theatrical gasp, pressing the back of her manicured hand to her forehead. She swayed dramatically on her expensive stilettos, her eyes rolling back in her head as her knees buckled. She expected a rush of concerned guests. She expected strong arms to catch her gasps of worry, a flurry of fawning attention. Instead, the remaining guests simply sidestepped her falling body like she was an inconvenient puddle on the marble floor. Eleanor hit the cold, hard ground with a heavy, undignified thud. Her pearl necklace snapped on impact, sending expensive little white beads scattering across the spilled wine and shattered glass. She lay there peeking through her eyelashes, waiting for someone to rush to her aid. Nobody even glanced in her direction. Her golden child was too busy staring at the television screen in catatonic horror, and her husband was too consumed by a murderous rage to notice her performance. Richard did not notice his wife on the floor. His mind had completely snapped. The polished, arrogant patriarch who had ruled our family through financial intimidation was gone, replaced entirely by a rabid, cornered animal. A terrifying, inhuman snarl ripped from his chest. He lunged across the ruined cocktail table with a speed and ferocity born of pure madness. His large hands shot out, bypassing Jamal's ruined lapels and clamping directly around the younger man's windpipe. The force of the tackle sent both men crashing hard onto the marble. Jamal choked, his eyes bulging instantly as Richard squeezed with lethal, homicidal intent. Richard straddled him, pressing his thumbs deep into Jamal's throat, his face completely purple with pure rage. "I will kill you," Richard screamed, spit flying onto Jamal's terrified face. "I will choke the life out of you right now for what you did to my money." Olivia finally snapped out of her shock. She let out a blood-curdling shriek and threw herself at her father's back, clawing uselessly at his tailored suit jacket. "Let him go!" Olivia shrieked, her voice tearing at the seams. "You are killing him!" Dad let him go, but Richard was completely deaf to her cries. Jamal's face was rapidly turning a deep, sickly shade of blue, his hands weakly slapping at Richard's iron grip. The scene had crossed the line from a financial scandal to an active crime scene right before my eyes. I stood completely still, watching the violent implosion of my family with a profound, icy detachment. I did not intervene. I simply turned my head slightly and met Mr. Gallagher's calm, observant eyes. He gave me a single crisp nod. He raised two fingers in a silent, practiced command. The two massive private security contractors who had accompanied us into the mansion stepped forward with terrifying efficiency. They did not shout. They did not panic. They simply moved in, grabbed Richard securely under his armpits, and effortlessly peeled him off the gasping, choking Jamal. Richard kicked and thrashed, howling obscenities at the ceiling, but the bodyguards easily pinned his arms behind his back, hauling him to his feet and forcing him to stay immobile. Jamal rolled onto his side on the wet marble, coughing violently and clutching his bruised throat as he sucked in ragged, desperate lungfuls of air. The grand ballroom was now completely empty of its glamorous guests, leaving only the shattered remnants of my family wallowing in their own destruction amidst the ruined catering and broken glass. Eleanor was still sitting on the floor, her fake faint abandoned as she stared at the violent scene in mute horror. Olivia was sobbing uncontrollably, her perfect dress ruined, hovering near her gasping husband, but too afraid to touch him. Richard was straining against the bodyguards, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a hatred so deep it bordered on total insanity. Mr. Gallagher calmly stepped into the exact center of the wreckage. He adjusted his tailored charcoal suit jacket, pulling the lapels straight, utterly unbothered by the screaming and the violence that had just occurred. He looked down at Jamal, then shifted his cold professional gaze to my father. He cleared his throat. It was a sharp, authoritative sound that instantly commanded the absolute attention of every single person left standing or sitting in the room. "I sincerely apologize for interrupting this highly entertaining family drama." Mr. Gallagher stated, his voice ringing with absolute chilling authority. "But as the senior legal representative of Apex Holdings, I have a formal notification to deliver to all of you. Due to the fact that Mr. Jamal has failed to meet his margin calls and is currently 30 days past due on his massive shadow market loans, the banking institution officially liquidated his positions earlier today. They subsequently sold the bad debt, including the collateralized deed to this entire estate, directly to our firm. The foreclosure order was heavily expedited through the courts and went into full effect at exactly 5 o'clock this afternoon. This house is now the legal property of Apex Holdings, and you are all currently trespassing on my client's land." The words hung in this grand ballroom, echoing off the vaulted ceilings like a death sentence. trespassing on my client's land." The absolute finality of that statement hit Richard with a physical force. The furious homicidal energy that had fueled his attack on Jamal vanished instantly. He stopped struggling against the massive security contractors holding his arms. His muscles went entirely slack. The bodyguards sensed the fight leave him and simultaneously stepped back, releasing their iron grip. Richard swayed on his feet. The perfectly tailored Italian tuxedo now looked like a crumpled, ill-fitting costume on a man who had suddenly aged 20 years in a matter of seconds. He stared blankly at Mr. Gallagher. His brain, usually a steel trap of corporate strategy and ruthless calculation, completely misfired. He opened his mouth to speak, to issue another threat, to demand his lawyers, but no sound came out. The harsh reality of foreclosure, a concept he had weaponized against countless vulnerable business rivals throughout his career, was now sitting squarely on his own chest. His empire was not just crumbling, it was already gone. Apex Holdings owned the very marble beneath his Italian leather shoes. Slowly, painfully, Richard's knees buckled. The sound of his kneecaps hitting the hard stone floor echoed sharply in the cavernous room. It was a sound I never thought I would hear. Richard Vance, the undisputed tyrant of our family, the man who demanded absolute submission from everyone in his orbit, had fallen to his knees. He looked small. He looked incredibly fragile. Eleanor let out a sharp, breathless gasp from her spot on the floor. She scrambled backward, her hands sliding frantically through the spilled champagne, utterly horrified by the sight of her invincible husband groveling. Olivia whimpered, shrinking away from Jamal and pressing her back against the nearest wall, completely paralyzed by the unfolding nightmare. "Mr. Gallagher?" Richard croaked, his voice cracking, entirely stripped of its former booming authority. "Mr. Gallagher, please. You are a reasonable man. I know your firm. I have done business with Apex Holdings before. This is a massive misunderstanding, a catastrophic miscalculation by an idiot boy who had absolutely no right to leverage my assets." Mr. Gallagher looked down at my father with the cold, detached expression of a surgeon examining a terminal patient. He did not offer a hand to help Richard up. He did not step away. He simply stood perfectly still, a silent monolith of corporate execution. "Listen to me," Richard pleaded, his hands reaching out, his fingers desperately grasping at the empty air between them. "You cannot just throw us out into the street. Not tonight. Not like this. I have a reputation. I have a legacy in this town. You give me 1 week, just 7 days. I will fix this entire disaster. I swear to you on my life." Richard was panting now, a thick sheen of cold sweat coating his pale forehead. He was bargaining for his life, throwing every piece of collateral he had ever valued onto the imaginary negotiating table. "I will sell the family corporation," Richard babbled, his words tumbling out in a frantic, desperate rush. "I will bypass the board of directors. I will liquidate my entire controlling stake by tomorrow morning. I do not care what the market price is. I will sell it for pennies on the dollar if I have to. It will generate more than enough capital to cover this $12 million debt and compensate Apex Holdings for all your trouble and legal fees. You will make a massive profit. Just halt the foreclosure. Give me the extension, please." The sheer desperation in his voice was thick and suffocating. This was a man who had spent his entire life valuing wealth over his own blood status, over his own children. And now he was willingly offering to butcher his precious company, his true golden child, just to maintain the illusion that he still had a home to sleep in. Mr. Gallagher did not react to the frantic promises. He did not blink at the offer of liquidated corporate shares or massive instant profits. He remained a portrait of absolute unyielding professionalism. He reached up with one hand, his fingers elegantly brushing the bridge of his nose, and calmly pushed his wire-rimmed glasses higher up on his face. "I hear your proposal, Mr. Vance." Mr. Gallagher stated, his tone perfectly, even devoid of any sympathy or malice. "And I understand the extreme urgency of your current predicament. However, you are directing your negotiations toward the wrong individual." Richard blinked, his tear-filled, bloodshot eyes staring up at the lawyer in pure confusion. "What are you talking about?" Richard stammered, his hands dropping uselessly to his sides. "You are the senior legal representative. You hold the paperwork. You have the authority to grant an emergency stay of execution on the property. I am merely the legal counsel executing the precise directives of my client, Mr. Gallagher replied smoothly. Apex Holdings is indeed the firm managing the debt, but the debt itself, and by extension the deed to this estate, was purchased outright through a private acquisition fund managed under the Apex umbrella. I do not have the authority to grant you an extension. I do not have the power to accept your corporate shares in exchange for this property. Mr. Gallagher lowered his hand and locked eyes with my father. The only person who possesses the authority to negotiate the terms of your eviction or to grant you a stay of execution on this foreclosure is the primary stakeholder of that private acquisition fund. Mr. Gallagher said, his voice dropping slightly in pitch, carrying a weight that made the air in the room feel heavy and cold. And she is standing right behind you. Richard froze, his breathing hitched, catching roughly in his chest. A profound, paralyzing dread washed over his pale face. The realization hit him slow and agonizing, twisting his features into a mask of pure terror. He slowly pushed himself up off the wet marble, his joints popping, his body trembling violently. He turned around, his eyes wide and completely hollow. He looked directly at me. I stood there perfectly composed, my hands resting casually by my sides. I looked at the man who had mocked my dreams, the man who had stolen my inheritance to buy a fake future for my sister. The man who had declared me a failure and ordered me out of his house. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply looked at him, letting the absolute reality of his complete destruction settle heavily onto his shoulders. I own this house, Richard. I said, my voice cutting through the silence with lethal precision. And your lease is officially expired. The absolute finality of my words hung in the suffocating air of the ruined ballroom. Richard remained paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, utterly unable to comprehend that his estranged, discarded daughter was now his literal landlord. Then the fragile silence shattered. "That is impossible!" Olivia shrieked, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical register. She pushed away from the wall, her wet face twisting into an ugly mask of pure denial. She pointed a manicured finger at me, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. "You are lying. You are a pathological liar." Olivia stomped her foot on the stained marble, completely losing the last remaining shreds of her carefully crafted Ivy League composure. "She is just a computer repair brat," Olivia screamed, turning her wild eyes toward Mr. Gallagher and the security team. "She used to fix broken laptops in a dingy basement across town. She does not have any real money. She certainly does not have the millions of dollars required to buy out a massive Wall Street debt. She is playing a sick, twisted joke on all of us. Where would a stupid loser like her get the money to represent the prestigious Apex Fund?" Her frantic accusations echoed off the vaulted ceilings, desperate and utterly pathetic. Eleanor nodded along from her position on the floor, clinging blindly to Olivia, and her frantic denial, desperate for any alternate reality where they were not currently ruined. They needed to believe I was still completely beneath them. I did not raise my voice. I did not rush to defend myself against her manic, flailing insults. I simply maintained my steady gaze, letting her expend the very last of her frantic energy. Moving with deliberate precision, I walked past my trembling father. My heels clicked rhythmically against the marble, the only sound in the room now that Olivia had finally run out of breath. I approached the only table that had survived Richard and his violent outburst. I reached out, picked up a pristine crystal flute, and smoothly poured myself a glass of vintage champagne from an open, chilled bottle. The golden liquid bubbled and hissed a sound that felt incredibly loud in the terrified silence of my former family. I took a slow, appreciative sip, letting the crisp, expensive taste linger on my tongue before lowering the glass back to the table. "I am not a computer repair technician, Olivia," I stated, my voice echoing with a cold, terrifying calmness. "I have not fixed a broken laptop in over a decade, but you would not know that because none of you have bothered to check on my existence since the day you threw me out on the street like garbage." I turned to face Richard and Eleanor, watching the raw fear finally settle permanently into their eyes. The power dynamic in this massive room had completely shifted, and they were entirely defenseless against the incoming storm. 15 years ago, you expelled me from this exact house, I said, gesturing to the grand walls surrounding us. You told me I was defective. You told me I was an absolute embarrassment to the pristine Vance family name because I struggled to read your precious, pretentious literature. You diagnosed my severe dyslexia as pure, incurable stupidity. You decided that a child whose brain processed information differently was a defective product that needed to be discarded immediately to protect your flawless social image. Eleanor flinched visibly, her eyes darting away from mine, completely unable to face the ugly truth of her own horrific maternal failures. She was shrinking under the crushing weight of her past actions. When you kicked me out with nothing but a single duffel bag and the clothes on my back, you told me I would end up starving in a gutter. I continued taking another slow step toward them. You told me my brain was entirely useless. But my brain was not useless, Mother. It was simply wired for a completely different language. A language that did not rely on your archaic social rules or your traditional academic standards. I looked down at the terrified faces of the people who had tormented me for my entire childhood. While you were busy buying Olivia a fraudulent entrance ticket to Harvard with my stolen inheritance, I was living in a damp, freezing garage. I explained, my tone completely devoid of any lingering emotion. I spent every single waking hour of the last 15 years teaching myself algorithmic programming. I learned to speak in pure code. I discovered that while my eyes jumbled standard letters and paragraphs, I could see complex mathematical patterns and predictive data structures with absolute crystal clear perfection. Richard swallowed hard, his throat bobbing nervously as the full weight of his monumental miscalculation began to crush him. The realization was finally penetrating his thick skull. I did not just build a simple tech business, I said, raising my champagne glass as if proposing a toast to their utter destruction. I engineered a highly advanced predictive artificial intelligence software. I built the exact proprietary algorithms that major Wall Street institutions now rely on to analyze price and liquidate high-risk shadow market debt. My software is the exact tool that flagged Jamal in his highly leveraged fraudulent cryptocurrency positions. My system is the exact reason his entire portfolio was violently liquidated yesterday afternoon. I saw the massive vulnerability he created, and I personally directed the acquisition of this specific toxic debt. Olivia shook her head, her hands covering her ears as if she could physically block out the reality of my words. No. She whimpered, stepping backward until she bumped into Jamal, who was still silently clutching his bruised throat. You cannot represent the Apex Fund. You are nothing. I took one step forward, looking into her panicked eyes. I do not work for the Apex Fund, I said. The company I founded was acquired by the Apex Fund yesterday. The statement hit the room with the force of a physical blow. The absolute finality of the word acquired hung suspended in the chilled air of the ruined ballroom. Olivia staggered backward as if she had been struck violently across the face. Her mouth opened and closed in rapid succession, but her vocal cords completely failed to produce a single sound. The manic, accusatory energy that had animated her entire body just seconds ago evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a hollow, trembling shell of a woman whose entire carefully constructed reality had just been obliterated. She looked at Jamal, still gasping pathetically on the wet marble, and then back at me, her eyes wide with a frantic, uncomprehending terror. Richard did not move. He stood completely paralyzed between the two massive security contractors, his chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic jerks. The arrogant patriarch, who had built an empire on intimidation, the man who had mercilessly mocked my intelligence and banished me from his sight, was currently experiencing a total systemic collapse. His face lost all remaining color, turning a sickly, translucent shade of gray. The muscles in his jaw twitched violently. He was a man watching his entire universe invert itself, his brain completely unable to process the mathematical impossibility of his discarded daughter conquering the apex predators of Wall Street. Even though Mr. Gallagher had explicitly declared the premises the legal property of Apex Holdings, the grand exodus of the Greenwich elite had paused at the perimeter. Gathered just beyond the heavy oak exit doors, clustered in the grand foyer, The socialites, hedge fund managers, and corporate vultures lingered. They were entirely too addicted to the spectacle of a high society slaughter to completely walk away. I could see the distinct glowing squares of their smartphones raised high above their shoulders. They were recording every single agonizing second of this absolute destruction. The modern Colosseum was actively broadcasting the final brutal execution of the Vance family legacy to the entire financial world. I maintained my absolute composure. I did not rush the moment. I savored the heavy, suffocating silence that had descended upon my former family. I reached into the interior breast pocket of my tailored blazer. My movements were deliberately slow, designed to stretch the psychological tension to its absolute breaking point. The soft, crisp rustle of fabric echoed sharply against the marble floors. I withdrew a pristine, heavy stock white envelope. The stark white rectangle looked almost aggressively clean against the backdrop of the shattered crystal, the spilled champagne, and the dirty, desperate faces of my parents. Eleanor pushed herself up slightly from the floor, her hands slipping in the puddles of alcohol. Her ruined pearl necklace lay scattered around her knees. Her eyes locked onto the white envelope with the primal, terrified focus of a cornered prey animal. She recognized the thick, watermarked paper. She recognized the undeniable aesthetic of institutional wealth. For her entire life, paper like that had been her weapon, her shield, her ultimate proof of superiority. Now it was being wielded against her by the very person she had tried to legally erase. I slid my index finger under the seal. The sharp tearing sound of the thick paper opening sliced through the dead quiet of the ballroom like a surgical blade. I reached inside and slowly withdrew a single rectangular slip of paper. It was a certified cashier check issued directly from the primary acquisition accounts of the Apex Fund. The paper was heavy, embossed with intricate security patterns and the unmistakable bold logo of the most ruthless financial institution on the eastern seaboard. I took a measured step forward. I raised my hand, elevating the certified check until it was perfectly level with Richard's completely defeated gaze. I held it steady, presenting the undeniable physical proof of my absolute victory. From the shadows of the grand foyer, I saw the glowing lenses of a dozen smartphone cameras instantly adjust and zoom in. They were hungry for the final detail. They wanted the exact number. They wanted the undeniable mathematical proof of the Vance family demise, immortalized in high-definition pixels. Richard's eyes tracked upward, his pupils dilated as they locked onto the printed ink. I watched his gaze sweep across the page, his mind desperately trying to count the commas, trying to verify the string of zeros that seemed to stretch endlessly across the paper. His lips parted, trembling uncontrollably as the sheer magnitude of the digits finally registered in his failing brain. His knees buckled slightly, supported only by the firm grip of the security guards holding his arms. $79 million, I read, my voice ringing out with crystal-clear, absolute authority. The words struck the marble walls and echoed back, wrapping around Richard, Eleanor, and Olivia like a suffocating shroud. $79 million. I let the astronomical figure hang in the air for a long, agonizing second, allowing the sheer weight of the capital to crush the very last remnants of their arrogant pride. I looked directly down into Eleanor's bloodshot, terrified eyes. "That is the value of the child you called retarded," I stated, my tone dropping to a dangerous, icy register that sent a visible shudder through my trembling frame. "That is the current market valuation of the defective product you threw out into the freezing rain. You spent my entire childhood trying to convince me that my brain was completely useless because I could not read your meaningless social scripts. You legally declared me mentally unfit so you could steal my future to finance Olivia's fraudulent Ivy League vanity project. But the brutal reality of the free market does not care about your country club pedigree, Mother. The market only cares about absolute, undeniable results." I shifted my gaze to Richard, who was now weeping silently, a single tear cutting a track down his gray, aging face. The tyrant was completely broken. And because I understand exactly how the market works, I decided to make a highly strategic investment with my new capital. I continued, my voice entirely devoid of pity or mercy. I stepped closer, holding the $79 million check inches from his face. I used a portion of this money to buy the exact bad debt of our family from the bank. I am not just the architect of the software that ruined you, Richard. I am the physical owner of your massive, catastrophic failure. I own your debts. I own your liabilities. I own the very floor you are standing on. You are absolutely nothing. The absolute finality of my words hung in the suffocating air of the ruined ballroom. Richard remained paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, utterly unable to comprehend the magnitude of his destruction. He slowly lowered his head, staring blankly at the wet marble floor, a completely broken man. I stepped back, letting the $79 million check catch the harsh light of the crystal chandeliers one last time, before slipping it smoothly back into the interior pocket of my tailored blazer. The sound of frantic, ragged breathing broke the heavy silence. It was Eleanor. But this was not the theatrical, performative gasping she used to manipulate country club committees and gala organizers. This was the raw, ugly sound of a woman realizing her entire social existence, her wealth, and her untouchable status had just been vaporized in an instant. Then a terrifying transformation occurred right before my eyes. Eleanor's survival instincts, honed by decades of ruthless social climbing and financial gold digging, violently overrode her shock. She looked at the pocket where I had stashed the certified check. She looked at Mr. Gallagher standing respectfully behind me as my legal counsel. She looked at the massive security contractors who now answered to my direct command. In the span of 3 seconds, the cold, arrogant matriarch who had looked at me with pure disgust her entire life completely vanished. In her place stood a grotesque, desperate imposter. Eleanor scrambled to her feet. Her expensive designer gown was soaked with spilled champagne and stained with the dirt from the floor, but she completely ignored the ruin of her appearance. She wiped her smeared makeup with the back of her trembling hand and forced her face into a wide, unnatural smile that was painfully disconnected from her terrified eyes. It was a sickening display of pure, unadulterated hypocrisy. "Naomi, my sweet, brilliant girl." Eleanor cried out, her voice pitching up into a saccharine maternal register that made my skin crawl. She took an eager step toward me, her arms opening wide as if preparing to embrace a long-lost war hero. "I always knew it. I always told your father that you were special. I knew you were always the best and the brightest out of all of us. You just had a different path, a unique genius that we could not understand at the time. We were just so hard on you because we wanted you to reach your ultimate potential." I stood perfectly still, watching this pathetic performance with icy detachment. Just beyond the Grand Oak doors, the crowd of Greenwich elites murmured loudly. The glowing squares of their smartphones were held high, recording every single humiliating second of the former high society queen groveling before her discarded daughter. Eleanor took another frantic step forward, her eyes darting nervously between me and the heavy security presence. "You are so incredibly successful now, Naomi. So incredibly rich and powerful. You proved all of us wrong, and I am just so immensely proud to be your mother. You have made your point perfectly clear, sweetheart. But you will not throw your own parents out on the street, right? You are a good girl. You have a forgiving heart. We can fix this entire mess. We can be a real family again." She gestured frantically toward Jamal, who was still coughing on the floor, and Olivia, who was hyperventilating against the wall, her hands clutching her ruined dress. "Please, Naomi." Eleanor pleaded, tears of pure desperation spilling over her false eyelashes. "Forgive Jamal. It was just a foolish, youthful business mistake. He is family. Think about little Stella. You cannot make your own niece homeless. For Stella's sake, we are a family. We need to stick together through this." With that final desperate plea, Eleanor lunged forward. She threw her arms out, intending to pull me into a tight, performative embrace for the watching cameras, desperate to visually cement her claim on my newfound, staggering wealth. She wanted the world to see a touching reconciliation. She wanted to absorb my power by proximity. I did not blink. I did not flinch. As her grasping hands reached for my shoulders, I simply pivoted on my heel and took one smooth, calculated step to the right. Eleanor momentum carried her heavily forward into empty air. Her expensive stilettos lost their fragile grip on the champagne-soaked marble. With a sharp, undignified shriek, her feet flew out from under her. She crashed face first onto the hard stone floor with a sickening heavy thud. The sound of her impact echoed loudly across the cavernous room. Her remaining pearls snapped the tiny white beads, scattering and bouncing away into the dark corners of the ballroom. She lay there, spread-eagled, groaning in genuine physical pain. Her perfect hair ruined her dignity, completely shattered. Nobody moved to help her. Richard was too consumed by his own catatonic shock, and Olivia was too paralyzed by fear to even step forward. The security guards remained like statues. I looked down at the pathetic heap of silk and desperation that used to be my mother. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no anger, no vindication. Just the cold, sterile satisfaction of a perfectly balanced equation. "Do not ever try to touch me," I stated, my voice echoing clearly over her pained whimpers. "And do not ever dare to use the word family in my presence again. You do not know the meaning of the word. A family protects its own. A family does not throw a struggling teenager out into the freezing rain and tell her she is a worthless drain on their resources. A family does not forge medical documents to declare their youngest daughter mentally incompetent just to siphon her trust fund." I slowly walked around her fallen body, my movements deliberate, ensuring I did not step on the ruined fabric of her gown. "You are invoking Stella, named to manipulate me," I continued, my gaze shifting briefly to Olivia, who flinched violently under my stare. "But you do not actually care about your granddaughter. You only care about the lavish lifestyle Jamal provided. If you cared about Stella, you would not have let her father gamble her future away on illegal, highly leveraged shadow market funds without asking a single question. Do not use an innocent child as a shield for your own grotesque greed." Eleanor slowly pushed herself up onto her elbows. Her nose was bleeding slightly, a thin red line staining her chin. She looked up at me, her fake maternal smile entirely replaced by a look of absolute, helpless terror. "But Naomi," she gasped, her voice trembling with raw fear. "We are your parents. We gave you life. You owe us. You have to share this with us. It is your duty to take care of us." I stopped pacing and stood directly over her. I looked down at her ruined face, remembering the exact words she had spoken to me just an hour ago when I first walked into this room, when she still believed I was poor, powerless, and beneath her contempt. "Earlier tonight, you stood in this exact room and loudly declared that I was a complete failure," I said, my voice cutting through the air like a diamond edge. "You looked me right in the eyes and explicitly told me I was entirely cut out of the will. You just said I had absolutely no right to a single cent of the Vance family inheritance." I leaned down slightly, closing the distance between us so she could see the absolute terrifying finality in my eyes. "It is a good thing I do not need an inheritance now," I said, pronouncing every single syllable with lethal clarity. "I am your creditor." The word hung over the ruined matriarch like a guillotine blade. Before the shock could fully paralyze the rest of the room, a sudden violent spasm of movement came from the far wall. Jamal pushed himself off the marble floor. His expensive Tom Ford suit was severely crumpled, one knee torn from his unceremonious collapse minutes earlier. He wiped a mixture of spit and spilled wine from his mouth, his chest heaving as he stared at me. The sheer panic that had previously choked him was rapidly morphing into the cornered, feral aggression of a desperate predator. "You are bluffing!" Jamal spat, his voice cracking initially before he forced it into a loud, booming register designed to command the room. He stepped over Eleanor, fallen body, ignoring her completely, and pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. "You do not have the capital to buy out our debt. This is an illegal corporate raid. It is a textbook hostile takeover fueled by corporate espionage." He turned his head wildly, seeking validation from the crowd of Greenwich socialites and hedge fund managers still recording from the foyer. He needed an audience. He needed to spin the narrative before the reality of his bankruptcy hit the morning papers. "You all see this?" Jamal yelled, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "She is using insider information. She breached confidential financial algorithms at Apex Holdings to manipulate the market against my firm. I am a licensed broker. I know exactly how this works. I will have you indicted for securities fraud by tomorrow morning, Naomi. I will drag you into federal court and sue you for every single penny of that $79 million. You will be sitting in a federal penitentiary before the week is over." I did not move a single muscle. I let his frantic, hollow threats wash over me, analyzing the precise frequency of fear vibrating in his vocal cords. He was unraveling completely, throwing legal terms into the air like a smokescreen to hide his absolute incompetence. When his threats of litigation failed to elicit even a flinch from me, Jamal shifted his strategy. The aggressive corporate raider persona vanished instantly, replaced by the performance of a persecuted martyr. He threw his arms wide open, turning fully toward the glowing smartphone cameras. "This is what they do," Jamal proclaimed, his voice dripping with sudden manufactured anguish. "This is exactly what the established elite does to a self-made man of color. I had to fight and claw for every single ounce of success I achieved. I had to work 10 times harder than any of these silver spoon legacy brats just to get a seat at the table. And the second I stumble, the second I face a temporary liquidity issue, this privileged, vindictive sociopath decides to financially lynch me. You are just angry because a black man married your golden sister and proved he was smarter than your entire legacy family. This is systemic destruction. You are targeting a minority-owned firm because you cannot stand seeing me succeed." A heavy, uncomfortable murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. Jamal was playing his final, most desperate card, weaponizing his identity to excuse his catastrophic financial negligence. Olivia perked up slightly from her corner, her eyes darting around, hoping this narrative would somehow save her luxury lifestyle. I raised my right hand. The murmur in the room instantly died. Mr. Gallagher stepped forward from the shadows. He did not speak. He simply handed me a massive leather-bound document folder. It was thick, heavy, with hundreds of pages of unredacted financial forensics wire transfer receipts and offshore banking logs. The physical weight of it felt substantial in my hands. I stepped over my mother, closing the distance between Jamal and myself. The false bravado vanished from his face as I approached. His eyes locked onto the thick folder, his pupils dilating in primal terror. "You are not a self-made man, Jamal," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion, cutting through the silence with surgical precision. "You are a parasite. You did not claw your way to the top through hard work and brilliance. You married into the Vance family specifically to access my father-client list. You used Richard's reputation to legitimize your shadow funds. And when your highly leveraged, utterly incompetent crypto investments collapsed last quarter, you did not just lose your own money." Jamal took a step backward, his shoulders hitting the mahogany wainscoting. He opened his mouth to shout another defense, but no sound came out. "I know exactly how you tried to cover your margin calls." I continued, taking another slow step forward, trapping him against the wall. "I know about the shell corporations registered in the Cayman Islands. I know about the falsified quarterly earnings reports you submitted to the SEC. But most importantly, Jamal, I know exactly whose money you stole to keep your sports cars and your private club memberships." He began to shake. A visible, uncontrollable tremor took over his entire body. Sweat poured down his forehead, stinging his eyes. "I did not use insider trading to dismantle you," I stated, raising the heavy leather folder. "I simply followed the digital fingerprints you were too stupid to erase. I bought the bad debt of this family, yes. But I also purchased the absolute undeniable proof of your criminal enterprise." With a swift, aggressive motion, I slammed the thick file folder directly into Jamal's chest. He gasped, his arms instinctively coming up to catch the heavy stack of documents before they hit the floor. He clutched the damning evidence against his ruined suit, his eyes wide and terrified. "I bought the original files proving you laundered money from the Ohio Retired Teachers Pension Fund." I declared, my voice ringing out with absolute terrifying authority. "You stole the life savings of thousands of elderly people to float your fraudulent lifestyle. You drained their retirement accounts to buy Olivia diamond necklaces and to lease private jets. That is not systemic oppression, Jamal. That is grand larceny. He stared down at the folder in his hands as if it were a live explosive device. His breath hitched in a series of shallow, panicked gasps. This evidence goes to the FBI in exactly 10 minutes, I said, checking the sleek face of my watch. A secure encrypted data packet is already queued for transmission to the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau. I smiled, a cold, razor-sharp expression that offered absolutely no mercy. You are not losing your house, Jamal. You are getting a free jail cell. Jamal's knees buckled under the absolute weight of his destruction. He slid down the mahogany wall, hitting the marble floor in a pathetic, whimpering heap, clutching the evidence of his own federal indictment to his chest. I turned my gaze away from his pathetic form and shifted my focus to the corner of the room. Olivia was standing completely rigid. The glamorous Ivy League socialite who had spent her entire life parading her superiority over my existence was currently vibrating with pure, unadulterated terror. She looked at Jamal kneeling in the puddle of his own ruined empire, and in that exact second, the absolute core of her character revealed itself. She did not rush to her husband's side. She did not drop to her knees to comfort the father of her child. Instead, Olivia physically recoiled from him. She took a deliberate, calculating step away from the man she had married, instinctively severing her ties to a sinking ship. Naomi. Olivia gasped, her voice shrill and trembling as she stumbled forward. She pushed past Jamal as if he were nothing more than a piece of discarded furniture. She stopped 3 feet away from me, her manicured hands clasping together in a frantic, desperate, pleading gesture. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled, and the heavy diamond necklace around her throat suddenly looked like a glittering noose. Naomi, you have to listen to me, Olivia cried, her voice cracking as she adopted the pathetic, victimized tone she had weaponized since childhood. I had absolutely nothing to do with his business. You know how Jamal is. He is secretive and controlling. He never let me see the actual financial algorithms. He lied to me, just like he lied to everyone else. I am a victim here too, Naomi. You cannot punish me for the crimes of a man who manipulated me. I stared at her, my expression completely neutral, letting her frantic lies hang in the cold air of the ballroom. She was shedding her husband with the same ruthless efficiency she had used to shed me when I was declared mentally unfit. Please, Sister Olivia begged, taking another step closer, her eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic panic. You have Apex Holdings now. You have billions of dollars in capital and a massive corporate infrastructure. You are going to need elite representation. You are going to need a legal mind you can actually trust. I am a Harvard-educated lawyer, Naomi. I graduated at the top of my class. I have the pedigree, the country club connections, the intimate knowledge of how the Greenwich elite operate. Let me work for you. I will draft every contract. I will manage every hostile acquisition. I will work for your firm completely pro bono for the rest of my life. Just let me keep my social standing. Let me stay in the family. Do not take my name away. The sheer audacity of her bargaining attempt was mathematically fascinating. Even now, standing in the rubble of her completely fraudulent life, Olivia genuinely believed her fabricated status held intrinsic value in my eyes. She truly believed her purchased credentials could be used as currency to buy her way out of total destruction. I let out a short, sharp laugh that held absolutely no humor. The sound cut through her desperate pleading, freezing her in place. You want to offer me your legal services? I stated, my voice echoing loudly across the ruined ballroom. You think your Ivy League pedigree is a shield you can hide behind. But we both know the mathematical truth about your brilliant legal mind, Olivia. We both know exactly how you secured that Harvard admission. Olivia's breath hitched. Her face lost all remaining color, turning the shade of dead ash. She instinctively took a step back, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. Your entire academic career was a massive, expensive fabrication. I continued, taking a deliberate step toward her, forcing her to look directly into my terrified eyes. You did not earn your way into that university with your intellect. Richard and Eleanor bought that acceptance letter by liquidating the trust fund that my grandfather explicitly left for my care. They legally declared me a defective burden, so they could legally siphon my capital to finance your vanity project. Your prestigious degree was purchased with the money stolen from my future. I do not need a Harvard lawyer whose entire credential was bought with my own stolen equity. Olivia began to shake violently, her perfect facade crumbling into a grotesque mask of pure panic. "But I am innocent in his fraud," she sobbed, pointing a shaking finger at Jamal. "You cannot ruin me for what he did." "You are not innocent," I replied, my voice dropping to a dangerous icy register that paralyzed her vocal cords. "I read the unredacted corporate tax filings, Olivia. You did not just spend the stolen pension money on your designer wardrobe and your luxury vehicles. You legally signed the incorporation documents for Jamal offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands. You sit on the board of directors for 3 of the fraudulent entities he used to launder the capital. You provided the legal loopholes he used to bypass the SEC oversight. You are not a victim, you are a fully complicit co-conspirator." I reached into my pocket and withdrew a slim silver flash drive. I held it up between my fingers, letting the crystal light catch the metal surface. "I do not need a Harvard degree bought with my own money," I stated, my voice ringing with absolute merciless authority. "Furthermore, I already forwarded the entire forensic accounting file regarding your joint financial fraud to the American Bar Association 10 minutes ago. You will be completely disbarred and publicly disgraced before you even get the chance to defend yourself." The brutal, definitive execution of Olivia's career served as the final breaking point for the voyeuristic crowd gathered in the grand foyer. The Greenwich socialites, the hedge fund vultures, and the country club elite finally realized that the Vance family annihilation was not just a spectator sport, it was a highly radioactive crime scene. The moment I mentioned the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the American Bar Association, the collective appetite for drama instantly vanished, replaced by the primal urge to avoid federal subpoenas. Like a colony of startled rats fleeing a sinking ship, the guests turned and flooded out through the heavy oak doors. The grand exodus was completely silent, devoid of the usual air kisses and polite farewells. Within 90 seconds, the massive driveway was filled with the roar of luxury engines as valets frantically dispatched Porsches and Bentleys into the night. The grand ballroom of the Vance estate was finally empty, save for the heavy security presence Mr. Gallagher and the shattered, whimpering remnants of the people who used to be my family. The opulent space felt hollow, the silence broken only by Olivia hysterical sobbing and Jamal ragged, panicked breathing. Suddenly a violent rustle of fabric broke the quiet. Richard, who had remained frozen in a state of catatonic shock against the grand staircase, suddenly animated. The arrogant patriarch, the man who had mercilessly mocked my neurological differences and banished me from his sight, finally processed the absolute reality of his situation. He was not just bankrupt. He was about to be physically ejected from the monument to his own massive ego. Richard stumbled forward. His legs moved with a jerky, uncoordinated stiffness, his polished Italian leather shoes slipping on the champagne-soaked marble. He looked like an aging, wounded animal desperately trying to defend its dying territory. He bypassed Eleanor, who was still weeping softly on the floor, and ignored Olivia completely. His bloodshot eyes were locked entirely on me. Naomi. Richard choked out, his voice hoarse and completely stripped of its usual booming, tyrannical authority. He closed the final few feet between us and suddenly lunged forward. Before my security contractors could intercept him, Richard grasped my right hand in both of his. His palms were clammy, slick with cold sweat, and his fingers trembled violently against my skin. I did not pull away immediately. I simply stared at his hands, analyzing the biological manifestation of his complete surrender before shifting my cold gaze up to his desperate, tear-filled eyes. "Naomi, my brilliant daughter," Richard pleaded, his voice breaking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "I was blind. I was an absolute arrogant fool. I let your mother and your sister poison my mind against you. They convinced me you were a burden, but I should have seen your genius. I should have recognized the magnificent mathematical mind you possessed. You are the true heir to the Vance legacy. You are the only one who truly understands the market. He fell heavily to his knees, his expensive tuxedo trousers soaking up the spilled wine. He kept his desperate grip on my hand, looking up at me from the floor like a condemned prisoner, begging a merciless judge for a stay of execution. Please, Naomi. Richard begged, tears spilling down his ashen cheeks, dripping onto his starched white collar. You have proven your point. You have achieved absolute victory. You own the debt. You own the equity. But please do not take my home. I built this estate. This house is my entire life. He frantically pointed a shaking finger over his shoulder, gesturing vaguely toward Olivia and Jamal. I will do whatever you want, Richard cried, his voice echoing with sheer, unadulterated cowardice. I will disown them. I will throw Olivia and Jamal out into the street this exact second. They brought this ruin upon us. They are parasites. I will cut them entirely out of my life. Just let me and your mother stay here. We do not need the master suite. We will live in the guest house. We will live in the storage shed behind the pool house. We will be your servants. Just please let me stay on my property. Do not erase my legacy completely. I stared down at the man who had authorized my institutionalization. I watched him eagerly and instantly offer to sacrifice his beloved golden child just to maintain a pathetic, humiliating fraction of his former status. It was the ultimate irrefutable proof of the Vance family core algorithm, absolute parasitic self-preservation at the expense of everyone else. With a sharp, violent motion, I ripped my hand out of his sweaty grasp. The sudden force of the rejection sent Richard toppling backward onto the wet stone. You are willing to throw away your precious golden child that fast? I asked, my voice slicing through the ballroom with freezing surgical precision. Too late. Apex security team has already surrounded the entire perimeter of the estate. The local authorities have been notified of your eviction, and the FBI Financial Crimes Unit is currently coming up the main driveway. You have exactly 5 minutes to vacate my property before my guards physically throw you out into the freezing rain. The ticking of my watch seemed to amplify, echoing through the cavernous space like a judge gavel striking a solid block of wood. 1 minute down, 4 minutes remaining. Richard remained on the floor for a few agonizing seconds, his eyes darting wildly as if hoping to find a hidden trapdoor or a sudden change of heart in my expression. Finding neither, the survival instinct of a cornered rat finally kicked in. He scrambled to his feet, his movements clumsy and panicked. He lunged toward a priceless Ming vase resting on a gilded pedestal near the staircase, his hands wrapping greedily around the porcelain. Put it down, Richard! I commanded, my voice slicing through his frantic delusion. Mr. Gallagher stepped forward smoothly, flanked by 2 towering security contractors. The estate and all of its physical contents, including art, jewelry, and antiquities, are now the legal property of Apex Holdings, Mr. Gallagher stated with clinical detachment. You are permitted to leave with the clothes currently on your back. Nothing more. Richard's chest heaved, his face contorting in a mixture of rage and profound loss. He slowly released the vase, his fingers trailing over the smooth porcelain, as if saying goodbye to his only true love. 2 minutes down. Eleanor was still on the floor, crawling on her hands and knees in her ruined designer gown. She was desperately trying to scoop up the scattered pearls from her broken necklace, her hands slipping in the puddles of spilled champagne. The sheer indignity of the matriarch of the Vance family scrabbling in the dirt like a beggar was a spectacle I committed to memory. Leave them, Eleanor, I said. Your time is running out and the authorities are not known for their patience. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the grand ballroom, the darkness of the Greenwich night was suddenly shattered by rhythmic flashes of piercing red and blue light. The harsh illumination swept across the crystal chandeliers and painted the pale faces of my family in alternating shades of panic. The deep, heavy crunch of armored tires on the gravel driveway signaled the arrival of the federal convoy. Jamal's head snapped toward the windows. The reality of the flashing lights hit him like a physical blow. The illusion of his Wall Street bravado completely vanished, replaced by the primal, desperate instinct to flee. He scrambled up from the floor, his eyes darting frantically toward the service doors leading to the kitchen. He took 2 stumbling steps before a wall of black tactical gear blocked his path. The Apex security team had already locked down every single exit. 3 minutes down. The heavy oak doors of the grand foyer burst open. A team of federal agents strode into the mansion, their dark windbreakers emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the FBI. The lead agent, a tall woman with an expression as unyielding as carved stone, held up a thick stack of warrants. Jamal Vance and Olivia Vance, the agent, announced, her voice booming with absolute authority. You are both under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and securities fraud. Jamal completely broke. He threw his hands up, backing away from the advancing agents. It was her, he screamed, pointing a trembling finger at his wife. She is the legal counsel. She signed the incorporation papers for the offshore accounts. I just managed the portfolio. She structured the entire laundering operation. Olivia, who had been paralyzed against the wall, suddenly shrieked like a banshee. You liar! She countered, her voice reaching a hysterical pitch. You manipulated me. You told me those accounts were fully compliant with SEC regulations. I am a victim of his financial abuse. I will testify against him. I will tell you everything you want to know. It was a stunning, pathetic display of absolute zero loyalty. The glamorous power couple of the Greenwich elite, the Golden Sister, and the financial prodigy were now viciously tearing each other apart to save their own skins. The federal agents were completely unimpressed by the theatrics. They moved in with practiced efficiency, grabbing Jamal and Olivia by their arms, twisting them around, and snapping cold steel handcuffs around their wrists. The sharp metallic clicks echoed through the room, sealing the absolute finality of their new reality. You have the right to remain silent, the lead agent recited, pulling Olivia forward as she continued to sob and scream accusations at her husband. They were marched out through the grand foyer. Outside, the rain had begun to fall in heavy freezing sheets. A lingering pack of aggressive paparazzi, tipped off by the massive exodus of the party guests, had gathered at the perimeter of the police barricade. As Jamal and Olivia were dragged down the front steps, the night erupted in a blinding storm of camera flashes. The golden children of the Vance Empire were immortalized in high definition, their tear-stained, terrified faces splashed across the digital feeds of every major financial news network in the world. Their social execution was absolute and broadcast live. 4 minutes down. I turned my attention back to Richard and Eleanor. They stood completely frozen in the center of the ruined ballroom, watching their favorite daughter being stuffed into the back of a federal vehicle. They looked hollowed-out, empty shells of the arrogant tyrants who had ruled my childhood. Your 5 minutes are up, I stated, my tone offering zero room for negotiation. Mr. Gallagher gestured to the security team. Time to go, Mr. Vance. Mrs. Vance. 2 heavily armored guards stepped forward, firmly grasping Richard and Eleanor by their arms. There was no physical resistance. The fight had been completely drained from their bodies. They were marched toward the grand exit, their footsteps heavy and dragging on the marble. Just before they crossed the threshold into the freezing downpour, Richard stopped. He turned his head slowly, looking back at me, standing in the center of the vast glittering ballroom that he had spent his entire life building. His eyes were wide, filled with a desperate, uncomprehending sorrow. He opened his mouth, perhaps to issue one final plea, perhaps to offer a genuine apology, or perhaps just to beg for a scrap of mercy from the daughter he had thrown away. I did not wait to hear it. I stared directly into his eyes, raised my hand, and signaled the guards. Get them off my property, I commanded. The guards pushed them forward into the storm. The massive custom-built mahogany doors swung shut with a heavy, definitive thud, severing my past from my present. The automatic locking mechanism engaged with a sharp click. I stood completely alone in the center of the grand ballroom. The silence that descended upon the estate was absolute, profound, and beautifully heavy. The suffocating weight of my childhood, the endless years of being dismissed, humiliated, and discarded, evaporated into the cold, empty air. I walked slowly over to the panoramic windows and looked out into the darkness. Through the sheets of freezing rain, I watched the taillights of the federal vehicles and the police cruisers fade away down the long, winding driveway, taking the toxic remnants of the Vance family with them. The market had ruthlessly corrected itself. The liabilities had been completely liquidated, the toxic assets permanently discarded, and the true value of the portfolio had been firmly established. I adjusted the lapels of my tailored blazer, the crisp fabric resting perfectly against my shoulders. I was no longer the defective daughter. I was the architect of my own empire. The equation was finally balanced. I stood there for a long moment, letting the reality of my absolute triumph settle deep into my bones. The equation was finally balanced. Yet the physical cleanup of the Vance family disastrous reign had just begun. I turned away from the panoramic windows. The grand ballroom, previously a towering monument to their unchecked vanity and stolen prestige, was now a spectacular wasteland of shattered crystal and ruined silk. The long, magnificent banquet table stretched across the center of the room, looking like the chaotic aftermath of a violent storm. Half-empty bottles of vintage Dom Perignon lay discarded on their sides, the expensive golden liquid pooling into the pristine white linen tablecloths and dripping onto the floor. Smashed plates of imported beluga caviar, half-eaten truffles, and ruined exotic floral arrangements created a vibrant, colorful mess that perfectly mirrored the shattered, chaotic illusion of their generational wealth. It was a feast of lies completely abandoned by cowards. My tailored blazer felt like impenetrable armor as I slowly walked back toward the center of the room. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floor, a steady, unyielding metronome of control, replacing the frantic, panicked footsteps that had just echoed through this exact space. Mr. Gallagher and the elite Apex security team remained positioned silently along the perimeter of the room, their postures rigidly professional. They were watching me closely, waiting for my final directive, completely attuned to the shifting power dynamic of the estate. Through the massive glass panels flanking the heavy mahogany front doors, I could still see the pathetic, shivering silhouettes of Richard and Eleanor. The federal agents had already taken Jamal and Olivia away in handcuffs, but my parents had been left to their own devices. They were huddled together under the massive stone portico, terrified of stepping fully into the freezing, relentless rain. Their faces were pressed desperately against the wet glass of the doors. They looked like terrified, aging ghosts, haunting the edges of a kingdom they no longer possessed. They were watching my every single move, their eyes wide with a pathetic, lingering hope that I might suddenly experience a miraculous, daughterly change of heart. They were waiting for a reprieve that would absolutely never come. I ignored their pathetic display and stopped at the head of the ruined banquet table. This was the exact spot where Richard had stood mere hours ago, acting like a conquering king while trying to publicly humiliate me in front of his high society sycophants. My cold eyes scanned the wreckage of the feast until I found exactly what I was looking for. Resting near a spilled crystal goblet, partially stained with a deep ring of red wine, was a crisp white piece of thick, expensive cardstock. It was the $15,000 catering invoice for Olivia's extravagant, completely fraudulent Harvard graduation party. The exact same invoice Richard had aggressively thrown directly into my face at the beginning of the evening. He had hurled the paper at me like a physical weapon, mocking my independence, demanding that I pay for my own existence in his presence, treating me like a burdensome servant who owed him an infinite debt of gratitude. I reached down and picked up the heavy cardstock. The paper was slightly damp from the spilled wine, but the printed total of $15,000 was still bold black and clearly legible. I held it between my fingers, feeling the physical weight of their breathtaking arrogance. They had spent thousands of dollars celebrating a fake degree, bought with my stolen trust fund, and they had demanded I foot the bill. A heavy, expectant silence fell over the ballroom. Mr. Gallagher took a subtle step forward, his sharp eyes tracking the invoice in my hand. The security guards shifted their weight, their faces masked, but their attention entirely focused on me. Outside, pressed against the glass vestibule, Richard and Eleanor stopped shivering for a split second. I could see the sudden desperate spark of anticipation ignite in my father's bloodshot eyes. He saw me holding the invoice. His twisted transactional mind undoubtedly leaped to the most convenient self-serving conclusion. He genuinely believed that this was the moment I would falter. He thought that after completely destroying his empire and exposing his crimes, I was experiencing a sudden surge of familial guilt. He assumed I was going to pull out my checkbook, pay the caterers, and clear this final petty debt as an olive branch. He thought this was my final act of mercy to soften the brutal blow of their total annihilation. I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer and withdrew a sleek matte black fountain pen. It was a custom piece, the first luxury item I had purchased for myself after closing my very first multi-million-dollar acquisition at Apex Holdings. The cold metal felt solid and deeply reassuring in my firm grip. I smoothed the crumpled wine-stained invoice flat against a dry section of the polished mahogany table. The collective breath in the massive room caught. Even the hardened security guards seemed mesmerized by the quiet, deliberate, and surgical nature of my actions. Outside, Richard tapped his knuckles weakly against the thick glass, his face twisted in a pathetic, eager grimace of gratitude, fully convinced I was about to write a check to save him from this final indignity. I removed the cap from the fountain pen with a sharp, resounding metallic click that echoed across the empty ballroom. I did not reach for my checkbook. I did not write a signature of authorization for payment to the catering company. Instead, I pressed the sharp nib of the pen firmly against the bottom of the invoice, right below the extravagant $15,000 total. My hand moved with aggressive, flawless precision. The dark black ink flowed smoothly and permanently against the white cardstock. I did not write a promise of financial salvation. I wrote a legally binding, mathematically precise death sentence for their remaining delusions. Late move-out penalty. I wrote my handwriting sharp, elegant, and perfectly legible. $15,000 per day, starting tomorrow at exactly 8 in the morning. I carefully capped the pen and placed it back into my pocket. I picked up a heavy, solid silver carving fork from the wreckage of the dinner service. With a swift, brutal downward motion, I drove the silver prongs straight down through the center of the invoice, pinning the paper violently to the mahogany table. The sharp, violent sound of the metal biting deep into the expensive wood echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. I turned my body slowly and locked eyes with Richard through the rain-streaked glass. I raised my right hand and pointed a single, unwavering finger directly at the silver fork, pinning the new terms to his ruined dining table. His pathetic, hopeful smile instantly vanished, replaced by a mask of absolute soul-crushing despair as the reality of my message penetrated his arrogant skull. He finally understood that there was no mercy left in my heart, only mathematics. The heavy mahogany doors of the grand estate felt like paper as I pushed them open, stepping out from the ruined ballroom onto the massive stone portico. The freezing Greenwich rain immediately whipped against my face, soaking my tailored blazer, but the icy sting barely registered. I looked through the torrential downpour, past my shivering, ruined parents, huddled pathetically near the towering marble columns, and focused entirely on the sweeping gravel driveway. The federal agents had paused near the central marble fountain, waiting in the freezing deluge for the local police transport to arrive. Jamal and Olivia stood completely exposed to the violent storm, their expensive designer clothes plastered to their shaking bodies, their wrists bound tightly behind their backs in heavy steel handcuffs. Behind them, illuminated by the harsh, glaring security lights of the estate, sat Olivia's most prized material possession, a pristine, custom-ordered pearl-white Cadillac Escalade. I walked slowly down the wide marble steps. My heels clicked against the wet stone, a steady, relentless sound that cut through the chaotic noise of the storm. Olivia looked up as I approached. Her immaculate makeup was completely ruined, running in dark, jagged streams down her pale, terrified face. For a brief, pathetic second, her eyes widened with a desperate, delusional hope. She genuinely thought I was coming out into the rain to offer a last-minute reprieve, to save her from the ultimate social humiliation. I stopped a few feet away from her, ignoring her pleading gaze, and motioned to the massive, heavy-duty tow truck that had just silently glided through the main iron gates, trailing directly behind my Apex security vehicles. "You always loved that vehicle, Olivia," I said, my voice projecting clearly and coldly over the sound of the freezing rain. "You flaunted it at the country club. You used it as a mobile, vulgar monument to your manufactured superiority. You made sure everyone in this town knew exactly how much it cost." Olivia let out a wretched, wet sob, her shoulders shaking violently against the firm grip of the federal agent holding her. "Naomi, please!" she cried, her voice high and breathless, bordering on total hysteria. "You have everything now. You took the company. You took the house. You have the absolute power. Let me keep my car. It is leased in my name. I need it to start over." "Not anymore," I replied, turning my head slightly to watch the tow truck driver expertly back up toward the luxury SUV, the heavy steel hooks clanking loudly against the wet pavement. "I bought the debt on that vehicle yesterday afternoon. And since you are currently defaulting on every single financial obligation you possess, the bank has authorized an immediate unconditional repossession." "You cannot do this!" Olivia shrieked, struggling frantically against the agent, her wet, ruined hair whipping across her face. "That is my personal property. You cannot just take it. That is restitution," I corrected her, my tone completely devoid of sympathy, ringing out with absolute mathematical finality. "You and Richard willingly liquidated the trust fund my grandfather explicitly left for my care. You stole my equity to buy your fake way into Harvard. That Cadillac is currently valued at exactly the amount of capital you siphoned from my tuition account. Consider the debt officially settled. The car is being liquidated at auction tomorrow morning, and every single penny is going directly back into my accounts." Before Olivia could unleash another hysterical scream of protest, the shrill, deafening wail of police sirens ripped through the dark night air. 3 local Greenwich police cruisers sped aggressively up the winding driveway, their tires kicking up wet gravel. Their red and blue lights spun frantically, painting the rain-soaked estate and the terrified faces of my family in violent, chaotic colors. The transport had finally arrived. The heavy reality of the situation crashed down on the driveway. This was no longer a corporate negotiation or a hostile financial takeover. This was a brutal physical criminal extraction. The local officers stepped out into the freezing rain, moving with practiced tactical efficiency to take custody of Jamal from the federal agents. As a heavy-set officer grabbed Jamal fiercely by the bicep to shove him toward the back of the reinforced caged police cruiser, something inside Jamal completely shattered. The polished, arrogant hedge fund manager completely evaporated. In his place was a terrified, vicious, cornered predator, perfectly willing to chew off its own limb to escape the trap. Jamal dug his expensive leather shoes into the wet gravel, violently resisting the officers. He twisted his body around with surprising force, his eyes burning with absolute, unadulterated hatred as he locked his manic gaze directly onto Olivia. "You are going to stand there and play the innocent victim," Jamal roared, his voice cracking with pure, unhinged rage, entirely drowning out the sound of the storm and the screaming sirens. "You are going to pretend you knew nothing about the cooked books." Olivia shrank back, her eyes wide with fresh terror, shaking her head frantically. "Jamal, stop. Do not say anything else. Keep your mouth shut." "I am going to federal prison for this, but I am dragging you straight to hell with me," Jamal screamed, spit flying from his mouth as the officers struggled aggressively to push his head down into the police car. "Tell them the mathematical truth, Olivia. Tell them about the offshore shadow accounts in the Caymans. Tell them how you personally authorized the wire transfers to clean the cash." "He is lying!" Olivia shrieked, turning her desperate, tear-streaked face toward the federal agents. "He is trying to frame me to reduce his own sentence. I am a victim." "You knew exactly where that money came from!" Jamal bellowed, his voice echoing violently off the stone facade of the mansion, forcing Richard and Eleanor to watch the complete destruction of their legacy. "When the stolen pension fund money came into the primary accounts, you knew it was dirty. You audited the ledgers yourself. And what did you do? You told me to hide it better. You told me to route the capital through 3 different shell companies so you could buy your $200,000 diamond necklaces and your custom Cadillac without triggering an IRS audit. You signed the corporate incorporation papers. You spent the stolen money faster than I could launder it. The federal agents immediately pulled out their notebooks. Their eyes locked onto Olivia as Jamal continued to confess to every single crime on the driveway. You are a parasite! Olivia Jamal screamed, his voice turning hoarse as the police finally managed to shove him into the back of the cruiser. You manipulated me into this family. You told me this was how the elite operated. You promised me Richard would protect us from the SEC. You are the mastermind of the spending. Tell them how you forged the quarterly earnings to keep the credit lines open. The heavy door of the police cruiser slammed shut, cutting off the rest of his frantic, damning confession, but the damage was already permanently inflicted. Through the rain-streaked window of the police car, I could see Jamal's face pressed against the glass, screaming soundless curses at the woman who had helped orchestrate his absolute ruin. Olivia stood entirely paralyzed in the freezing rain, surrounded by federal agents who were now looking at her not just as a complicit wife, but as the primary target of a massive federal racketeering investigation. The tow truck engine roared to life, slowly pulling her pristine Cadillac away into the dark, stormy night, taking the very last piece of her stolen, fabricated identity with it. The red taillights of the tow truck bled into the heavy, freezing rain, dragging the final symbol of Olivia's stolen vanity down the long driveway. The federal agents did not give my sister a single moment to process the brutal betrayal of her husband. They gripped her arms tightly, her ruined designer gown clinging to her shaking frame, and marched her toward the second armored transport vehicle. She was completely paralyzed by shock, unable to even muster a scream as the heavy door slammed shut, sealing her inside. The police cruisers and federal vehicles pulled away in a synchronized convoy, the chaotic spinning of their red and blue lights gradually swallowed by the dark, stormy Greenwich night. I stood completely motionless on the top step of the marble portico. Below me, the reality of absolute irreversible ruin finally shattered the fragile cosmetic shell of my mother. Eleanor Vance could no longer maintain the polished illusion of high society grace. She watched the taillights vanish, taking her golden, perfect daughter to a federal holding cell, and a raw, guttural shriek tore violently from her throat. It was not a cry of sorrow. It was the horrific, jagged sound of an ego being ripped apart. She collapsed. Her knees hit the wet stone with a sickening thud. She threw her hands out, her expensive manicured nails scraping uselessly against the cold, hard marble. Then the flailing began. The matriarch of the Vance family, the woman who had spent decades dictating etiquette, judging the elite, and demanding absolute perfection from everyone around her, began to writhe on the ground like a petulant, irrational child. "You are a monster!" Eleanor screamed, her voice cracking, her face contorting into an ugly, unrecognizable mask of pure hatred. She beat her fists wildly against the wet pavement, splashing freezing water onto her ruined dress. "You are a demon. You are no daughter of mine. You are a cold-blooded, unnatural sociopath. How could you do this to your own flesh and blood? We gave you life. We gave you everything." I did not blink. I did not flinch. I simply stood there, my hands resting loosely at my sides, looking down at her from the top of the stairs. I watched her thrash in the relentless downpour, and I felt absolutely nothing. There was no anger left to burn. There was no sadness. There was no lingering sting of childhood rejection. There was only a profound, clinical, and beautiful emptiness. My silence was an absolute vacuum, and it was suffocating her. Eleanor expected a screaming match. She desperately craved a reaction. She wanted me to defend myself, to argue, to yell back, to show some tiny sign that her vicious words still possessed the power to cut me. She needed to know that she still held some fragment of control over my emotions. My utter freezing indifference was driving her completely insane. She scrambled to her knees, her soaked clothes dragging against the stone. Mascara ran down her cheeks in thick, dark rivers, staining her pale skin. She looked utterly deranged, a pathetic caricature of the terrifying tyrant who used to lock me in my room for speaking out of turn. You have no soul, she shrieked, pointing a trembling accusatory finger directly at my chest. You plotted this. You sat at our dining table, eating our food, smiling in our faces, while you meticulously planned to destroy us. You are a parasite. You are nothing but a jealous, bitter mistake. We should have thrown you out onto the street the day you were born. Beside her, Richard looked like a hollowed-out husk of a human being. The man who had ruled corporate boardrooms with an iron fist and terrorized his competitors now leaned heavily against a marble pillar, unable to even look at his wife, pathetic, undignified display. He stared blankly at the wet gravel, his jaw slack, the rain soaking his thinning hair. He finally understood that his empire was entirely gone, vaporized by the very daughter he had deemed financially useless. He had no fight left in him. Let her scream, I thought, watching Eleanor gasp for air. Let her ruin her throat. Let her exhaust every last ounce of toxic energy she possessed in her fragile, aging body. I had spent 30 years absorbing their poison. I had spent a lifetime internalizing their relentless criticisms, shrinking myself down to fit into the tiny, dark, suffocating corner they had assigned me. I had finally stepped out of that corner, and in doing so, I had crushed their entire universe under my heel. The elite Apex security contractors stood silently behind me, their faces impassive masks completely unbothered by the screaming woman on the ground. They were waiting for my order. Slowly, Eleanor's screams turned into ragged, breathless, pathetic gasps. She had no energy left. She slumped forward, her forehead resting against the cold, wet stone, shivering violently in the freezing downpour. She looked small, weak, and entirely broken. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute, broken only by the steady, rhythmic drum of the rain hitting the estate grounds. I took one deliberate step forward, my heels clicking sharply against the marble. I looked down at their ruined, pathetic forms. My voice was calm, steady, and utterly devoid of emotion. It cut through the freezing air like a surgical scalpel. You spent my entire life calling me an idiot, I stated, the cold clarity of my words echoing across the portico. But an idiot does not put themselves in the grave. You have exactly 12 hours to gather your personal clothing. Any piece of furniture taken from this estate will be considered theft of my property. Eleanor let out a choked, wet gasp. The sheer reality of leaving her grand estate with nothing but a suitcase of clothes finally broke the last fragile splinter of her mind. She curled into a tight, shivering ball on the wet marble, sobbing incoherently into her ruined designer sleeves. She was completely neutralized, no longer a threat, barely even a person. Her manicured hands clawed at the wet stone as if trying to anchor herself to a reality that had already dissolved. Richard, however, refused to surrender gracefully. He pushed himself away from the stone pillar. His expensive custom suit was entirely ruined by the freezing rain, his silver hair plastered flat against his scalp, but his eyes burned with a venomous, desperate fire. He stepped over his weeping wife, his jaw set in a hard, bitter line. He knew he had lost the company. He knew the federal government was dismantling his financial life. He knew the house belonged to me. The math was indisputable. He possessed zero leverage in the physical or legal realm. So he resorted to the only weapon he had left in his pathetic arsenal: psychological warfare. You think you have won, Naomi, Richard sneered, his voice dropping into a low, vicious register that used to send me running to my room in tears when I was a child. You think this hostile takeover makes you the ultimate victor. I did not move. I maintained my absolute freezing stillness, allowing him to dig his own grave. You have $79 million, he continued, taking a slow, shaky step toward me. You have the title to this estate. You have Apex Holdings. But look at what you have actually accomplished. You have completely destroyed your own blood. You have sent your perfect sister to a federal penitentiary. You have rendered your parents homeless in the middle of a storm. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs, glaring up at me through the driving rain. You are going to walk back into that massive empty mansion, and you are going to be entirely alone. You can buy all the corporate debt in the world, Naomi, but you cannot buy a single person who actually loves you. We are your family, and we are disowning you. We are cutting you off forever. You will be a complete social pariah. When the Greenwich elite find out what you did to us, No one will invite you to a single gala. No one will sit with you at the country club. You will sit in that giant silent ballroom with your millions, and you will rot in total isolation. You will die exactly as you lived in this house, unwanted, unloved, completely and utterly alone. His chest heaved as he delivered his final desperate verdict. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a manic, hungry anticipation. He was waiting for the armor to crack. He wanted to see my lower lip tremble. He needed to know that despite stripping him of his wealth and power, his approval was still the one thing I secretly, desperately craved. He wanted to see the rejected little girl cry for her father. A heavy, profound silence stretched between us, interrupted only by the relentless pounding of the storm against the stone portico. Mr. Gallagher shifted his stance slightly behind me, a silent offering of support, but I did not need it. I looked down at the man who had spent 3 decades measuring my worth in negative integers. I processed his cruel, venomous words, searching my chest for the familiar, suffocating ache of rejection. For years, that specific tone of voice would have paralyzed me. It would have sent me spiraling into a deep, dark well of self-doubt and misery. I found absolutely nothing. The emotional manipulation simply bounced off my skin like rain off a marble statue. The trauma bond was permanently severed. Slowly, a genuine, radiant smile broke across my face. It was not a smirk. It was not a grimace of pain. It was a bright, liberated, and entirely joyful expression that made Richard physically recoil in shock. His confident sneer instantly vanished, replaced by profound confusion. Family is not defined by shared genetics, Richard Weiss stated, my voice ringing out with crystal-clear conviction. Family is not a group of people who share blood only to use that connection to suck your blood dry. You and Eleanor did not raise me. You kept me as an insurance policy. You used my trust fund as a personal piggy bank. You handed me over to a hostile world the moment I stopped fitting into your perfect manicured aesthetic. I took a slow, deliberate step down the marble stairs, closing the distance, until I was looking directly into his terrified eyes. Family. I continued, my tone ringing with absolute truth, are the people who stand firmly by your side when you have absolutely nothing left to offer them. Family are the people who see your potential when you are trapped at the very bottom. Family are the people who help you build the ladder to climb out of the dark. I turned my head and looked back over my shoulder. Mr. Gallagher stood perfectly straight, his expression softening into a look of undeniable fatherly pride. Behind him, standing in the dry, warm grand foyer, was my core team from Apex Holdings. My brilliant analysts, my fierce legal counsel, my dedicated partners. They had driven through a severe storm at midnight to stand by my side and execute this extraction. They were watching me with unwavering loyalty and absolute respect. They were my chosen tribe. I turned my attention back to Richard. The rain was beginning to wash the last traces of his arrogant facade away, revealing the pathetic, weak man hiding underneath. "You are wrong about my future, Richard," I said, my smile widening into a brilliant display of absolute victory. "I am not going to be sitting alone in a silent mansion. I am going to gut this toxic house to the studs and rebuild it to my exact specifications. I am going to turn Apex Holdings into a global powerhouse. I am going to surround myself with people who value intelligence, loyalty, and ruthless efficiency." I stepped back up to the top of the portico, my tailored blazer shedding the freezing water. I looked at Richard and the weeping pile of silk that was Eleanor for the very last time. "I am not alone," I declared, my voice echoing with final, absolute authority. "And I certainly do not have the time to sit around rotting. I am far too busy." I turned my back on my former parents. I walked smoothly across the marble landing and stepped through the grand mahogany doors, passing Mr. Gallagher and my exceptional team. The heavy doors swung shut behind me with a solid, definitive thud. The thick glass completely muted the sounds of the storm and the pathetic, lingering sobs of Eleanor Vance. The heavy brass deadbolts engaged with a sharp, satisfying click. I stood in the warm, brilliantly lit foyer of my new estate. My team immediately gathered around me, their faces eager and ready for the next command. I slipped off my wet blazer and handed it to one of the security contractors. I smoothed my silk blouse and looked at Mr. Gallagher. Let us get to work, gentlemen, I said, walking briskly toward the West Wing executive office. We have a massive corporate portfolio to restructure before the morning bell. The West Wing executive office smelled faintly of his expensive cigars and absolute defeat. I bypassed his heavy leather chair and stood directly in front of the massive mahogany desk. Mr. Gallagher opened his briefcase, laying out the final transfer documents on the smooth wooden surface. The Greenwich police were still outside cataloging the perimeter, but the interior of the $17 million mansion belonged entirely to Apex Holdings. I signed my name across the final line of the master deed, the dark black ink binding my absolute ownership of the property forever. The house was secured. The physical assets were completely locked down. There was absolutely nothing left for me to do here tonight. I looked up at Mr. Gallagher and the elite security team standing at full attention. Lock down every single entrance, I commanded, my voice echoing slightly in the vast space. Do not let anyone cross the threshold under any circumstances. If Richard or Eleanor attempt to force their way inside the residence, you will immediately arrest them for criminal trespassing. I am leaving. I walked back through the grand foyer, my sharp footsteps echoing loudly against the soaring vaulted ceiling. The heavy mahogany front doors were swung wide open for me by a silent guard. I stepped back out into the freezing Greenwich night. The violent storm had slightly subsided into a heavy, relentless drizzle, but the atmosphere remained utterly chaotic and beautiful. The flashing red and blue lights of the remaining police cruisers sliced violently through the darkness. They cast sharp, rhythmic shadows across the gravel driveway and illuminated my calm face in alternating bursts of brilliant color. I walked slowly down the sweeping marble steps, pulling my tailored coat tighter against the biting winter chill. To my left, huddled miserably under the dripping stone portico, Richard and Eleanor were completely and utterly broken. Eleanor was a shivering, weeping mess collapsed on the cold ground. Her voice was completely hoarse from screaming, reduced now to pathetic, unintelligible whimpers that barely registered over the falling rain. She clawed at the wet stone, as if searching for a hidden trapdoor to escape her brutal new reality. Richard stood over her, his fists clenched tight at his sides, emitting a low feral growl of pure impotent rage. He glared up at me, his bloodshot eyes burning with the furious, terrifying realization that he was entirely powerless. Down the long driveway, the distant sound of Olivia hysterical crying echoed faintly from the back of the armored federal transport vehicle. It finally turned out of the main iron gates, carrying the golden child straight toward a cold federal holding cell. Their desperate noises, their fierce anger, their pathetic pleas all blended together into a meaningless, chaotic soundtrack. It was the glorious symphony of their ultimate destruction. I did not break my confident stride. I did not look back at them. The heavy mahogany doors slammed shut behind me with a thunderous, definitive crash. That heavy sound permanently locked the Vance family out of their own stolen kingdom forever. A sleek, black armored town car sat idling perfectly at the base of the marble steps. Its massive engine purred with a quiet, immense, and reassuring power. My personal driver, a highly trusted Apex contractor, immediately stepped out into the rain and opened the heavy rear door for me. I slid gracefully into the warm, luxurious leather interior. I welcomed the absolute perfect silence that completely enveloped me the very second the heavy bulletproof door closed shut. The endless chaos of my childhood, the vicious screaming, the cruel manipulation, the constant pressure to conform to their toxic ideology was finally severed. I sat back against the soft headrest and calmly pulled my encrypted mobile phone from the inner pocket of my blazer. The bright digital screen illuminated the dark, quiet cabin. I quickly opened my private, heavily secured offshore banking application. The primary dashboard proudly displayed the newly consolidated assets of Apex Holdings. The numbers had swelled massively, following the aggressive total liquidation of the Vance corporate portfolio. Right in the dead center of the glowing screen was the absolute crown jewel of my hostile financial takeover. $79 million. It was the exact sum of capital Richard had arrogantly attempted to hide, hoard, and use to perpetually control the false narrative of his own greatness. He had built his entire pathetic identity on the fragile illusion of that specific wealth. I firmly tapped the glowing screen with my right thumb. I bypassed the standard corporate holding accounts. I navigated directly to a completely independent offshore trust fund. I had meticulously established this specific account several months ago, entirely under my own name. It was permanently insulated from any future corporate litigation or desperate familial interference. I initiated the massive electronic transfer. The digital screen displayed a spinning loading circle for a fraction of a second before flashing a bright, solid green confirmation checkmark. The $79 million vanished instantly from the Apex holding account. It was safely and irreversibly deposited directly into my private, untouchable trust. The money was permanently secured. My ultimate financial safety net was forged in absolute unbreakable concrete. I locked my phone and slipped it into my coat pocket. I looked out the tinted window. Through the dark glass, I watched the $17 million mansion fade into the distance. It was a hollow monument to a family that placed money above human decency. They proudly called me the defective daughter. They labeled me the idiot because I refused to play their grotesque games. But the idiot had studied their methods. And the idiot utilized their toxic system to orchestrate their absolute destruction. I leaned forward, resting my hand on the leather partition. The night was dark, but my future was beautifully clear. "Let us go," I commanded, my voice smooth and steady. "Head straight to the new corporate headquarters." The heavy car accelerated down the wet road. "We have an empire to run,"